They moved into a house in Texas that wasn't empty. The first thing they found was the warm coffee cup in the attic, set carefully on a square of newspaper that had gone soft with dust. It was still giving off a faint smell, bitter and stale, as if someone had stepped away from it only minutes before. There was no electricity connected to the upper crawl space, no furniture, no reason for anyone to be there at all, yet the cup sat upright between the rafters, beside a folded blanket and a little pile of sunflower seed shells, as neat and ordinary as a place setting. Down below, the moving truck was still open in the yard, and the last of the afternoon light was crossing the pasture behind the house. Nothing in the wide, empty land around them suggested a neighbor close enough to wander in unnoticed. Nothing in the old sale records had suggested anyone else still had a claim to the property. The house stood outside a small Texas town where roads ran flat for miles, and the fences often outlasted the names of the families who built them. It was an older place, patched and repainted so many times that its walls held different ages and layers. The deed had been messy from the beginning. The closing attorney had explained in a tired voice that there were gaps in the ownership history after an older relative died without a clear will. Some names appeared twice in county papers. Others appeared once and never again. There had been tax notices, a probate filing that seemed to stop halfway through, and an unsigned transfer copied from a much older ledger. It was not unusual in that part of the state, they were told. Land stayed in families, houses passed hand to hand, records went missing, people died, and cousins argued, and sooner or later, someone sold what could still be sold. The couple who bought it were not reckless people. They were simply tired of rent and traffic and the long fluorescent fatigue of city life. The house was cheap for what it was, and from the road, it looked almost peaceful. There was a rusted windmill behind the barn, a dry stock tank beyond it, and an oak tree leaning toward the porch as if it had spent years listening. The rooms inside were larger than expected, with high ceilings and old wooden doors that did not quite fit their frames. The boards creaked, but not in any dramatic way. They creaked like old houses always do, giving back the heat they stored in the day and settling deeper into themselves after dark. That first evening, after the cup was found, they told themselves what people usually tell themselves when a place already feels strange. The realtor had workers in and out during the week. A handyman could have left it, one of the men from the moving crew could have slipped upstairs to get out of the heat, someone might even have been using the attic while the property stood empty. Rural houses drew wanderers sometimes, teenagers, hunters, transients passing through. It was unsettling, but not impossible. They threw the cup away, opened the attic window, and tried to laugh about it over takeout eaten from cardboard containers in the kitchen. Then, sometime after midnight, the woman woke to the sound of slow footsteps above the bedroom ceiling. Not the scurry of an animal, not the scratch of branches. These were measured steps, heavy enough to press dust from the cracks overhead, moving from one end of the attic to the other and then stopping directly above the bed. The house had no central air yet, and in the stillness, every sound traveled plainly. Her husband listened too. They lay there in the dark, not speaking until the steps resumed, and went away toward the back of the house. He got up, took a flashlight from a box in the hall, and checked every room downstairs before climbing the narrow stair to the attic hatch. By then, the sound had stopped. The insulation lay undisturbed. No blanket, no newspaper, no sign of the cup except the dark ring it had left on a board. The next day brought small contradictions. A kitchen cabinet they had emptied was standing open. A roll of paper towels they had set by the sink was gone, then turned up behind canned goods in the pantry. One of the back windows, painted shut for years, seemed to have been lifted from the outside and lowered again, leaving a clean line in the dust along the sill. These things had simple explanations when taken one at a time. Unfamiliar house, stress, half-unpacked boxes, but the unease did not come from any single event. It came from the shape they made together, as if a pattern were forming at the edge of vision and never holding still long enough to be named. The older neighbors, when approached carefully, were polite in the manner of people who have learned not to say too much at first. One woman at the feed store remembered the family that had lived there before the property went into confusion. Or rather, she remembered several families connected by marriage and grief and debt in ways that were no longer clear. A man had died in the house many years earlier. Another had left after a dispute over inheritance. Someone's daughter had come back for a while and then disappeared from conversation without anyone explaining where she went. The neighbor said there had always been stories about the place not staying empty when it ought to. She said it lightly, with a small smile, the way rural people sometimes mention old rumors without wanting to sound foolish. The house, she said, had a habit of collecting strays, sometimes cats. Sometimes people. That evening, while carrying flattened boxes to the burn barrel, the husband noticed that the padlock on the old storm cellar behind the kitchen had been cut long ago and then looped back through the latch to look intact. The doors were swollen with damp and earth, difficult to open. Inside, the cellar was mostly bare. There were shelves for canned food, a broken jar, the smell of old soil and limestone. But at the far end, where the light narrowed, there was a gap in the rear wall where the concrete had been chipped away around an older foundation line. Someone had stacked loose boards over it from the inside. Behind those boards lay a narrow passage just high enough for a person to crawl through on hands and knees. They did not go all the way in. The flashlight reached only a little distance before the passage bent out of sight. Yet even from the entrance, they could see things no abandoned space should have held. A plastic grocery bag, a fork, a clean blanket, a candle burned low in a jar lid. They backed out slowly, dragging the cellar doors shut with more force than necessary. Neither of them said much while the sun went down. It seemed important, suddenly, not to let their voices carry. They called the sheriff's office the next morning. A deputy drove out in a pale truck coated with road dust and listened without much visible surprise. According to reports from other parts of the country, old houses with voids between walls, attic runs, and service spaces had occasionally hidden people for days or even months. The word for it had begun appearing in public discussions, though most people still treated it like a story told online late at night. The deputy did not use the word. He only asked where the access points were. He looked through the attic, the cellar passage, the crawl space beneath the addition, and the barn loft. He found no one. He did find wrappers tucked in the insulation, a stack of old mail not addressed to the new owners, and several little nests of living made from items taken around the house. One of the missing towels, a spoon, a church bulletin, a cheap radio without batteries. He said someone had probably been using the spaces before the sale and was now coming back when the lights were off. He advised changing the locks anyway, though both of them understood locks mattered less when a person already knew the hidden ways in and out. For 2 nights, nothing happened. They slept with a lamp on and the bedroom door closed. The quiet became almost worse than the noises had been. A quiet house asks to be trusted. By the 3rd night, they began to feel ashamed of their own fear. The deputy's search had been thorough. The locks were new, the cellar passage had been nailed shut. It was possible, they said, that the whole thing had ended. Then the dog started looking at the laundry room wall. He was an old animal and not easily excited. They had brought him from the city because he followed them from room to room and could not bear separation. In the new house, he had seemed uneasy from the first hour, but on the 4th evening, he planted himself in front of the laundry room, ears low, and began to growl at a section of wall beside the water heater. It was a soft, constant sound, more troubled than aggressive. When the husband tapped the paneling there, the sound that came back was wrong, not solid, hollow. A contractor they reached the next day confirmed that the room had once been larger and then boxed in, leaving a chase between 2 walls that ran toward the old kitchen. The panel came loose with only a pry bar and a little pressure. Behind it was a standing space no wider than a coffin turned upright. There were shelves set between studs, hooks made from bent nails, a narrow mattress folded in half, empty food tins, a transistor radio, and 3 little circles marked on the wood where candles had burned down to wax. On one shelf sat a row of objects taken from the house over the last week. The missing paper towels, a kitchen knife, a family photograph still in its moving box, her hairbrush, one of his shirts. None of it looked stolen for money. It looked selected, kept, touched. At the back of the cavity, there was a second opening, almost invisible in the shadow, leading deeper toward the heart of the house. Cool air came through it, carrying the faint scent of soap and something older beneath it, the close smell of skin trapped in stale wood. This time, the sheriff's office returned with more men. They searched for hours. The hidden route twisted through walls and dead spaces left by additions made over several decades. It connected the laundry room to a strip behind the pantry, then up by a ladder cut into framing toward the attic eaves. There were marks everywhere that suggested long use: smoothed boards where hands had steadied themselves, cloth stuffed into openings to muffle sound, view holes no wider than coins looking into the kitchen, the hallway, and one corner of the bedroom. Yet once again, no person was found. The officers were forced to admit what the couple already knew. Whoever had been in the house understood it better than anyone living above the floorboards. By then, the story had reached the town in the incomplete, altered form such stories always take. Some said a drifter had taken shelter there. Some said a relative had never accepted the sale and was hiding in the structure to frighten the buyers out. Some remembered older local talk about a family member who had lived in the walls as a child during ugly domestic disputes, slipping through vents and service gaps to avoid a violent father. Others believed the hidden passages dated back much earlier to a time when people in isolated farmhouses used storm cellars and false walls to conceal cash, liquor, or kin they did not want county officials asking about. According to local memory, the house had gone through periods when windows opened by themselves, canned food vanished, and lights appeared in places with no power. None of this proved anything. It only deepened the sense that the new owners had entered a story that was already old when they found it. They moved most of their belongings into one locked room and kept the rest loaded in the truck. Sleep came in pieces. The husband began waking with the certainty that he was being observed from just beyond the dark. More than once, he rose and switched on the light to find nothing changed except the dog sitting rigid and facing the closet. The woman noticed that a hymn she had been humming in the kitchen one afternoon came back to her later from the attic, not sung, only tapped out in a slow rhythm above her head, as if someone had learned it by listening. One morning, she found a fresh bar of soap in the shower with a thumbprint pressed into it. They should have left then. By any sensible measure, they stayed too long. But leaving a house is not as simple as turning away from a motel room. There were loans, contracts, pride, the exhausting stubbornness that rises when people feel they are being pushed from something they paid for. They told themselves they wanted proof. They told themselves they wanted the sheriff to catch whoever was doing it. They told themselves they could not abandon the place over sounds in the walls. The final night began with rain. Not a storm, only a steady fall that darkened the pasture and filled the gutters until the whole house seemed wrapped in running water. Near midnight, the power flickered. The lamp in the bedroom went out and came back weakly. Somewhere in the passageways, something moved with sudden purpose, not the careful drifting they had grown used to, but a quick, committed motion through wood and plaster. The dog barked once and then yelped. The husband ran into the hall with a flashlight and heard a door closing at the far end of the house, though every visible door was still open. They found the dog trembling in the kitchen. The back porch door was unlatched. Mud had been tracked in across the floor, not from outside, but from the pantry, where a section of shelving now stood ajar like a mouth. Behind it, in the hidden run, the flashlight beam shook over hanging cloth, scattered tins, and a fresh footprint in damp earth. It was bare, small but not childlike, human, leading inward. They called 911 and were told deputies were on the way. Until then, they stayed together in the kitchen with the lights on and every visible entrance watched. Rain hissed outside, water dripped from the eaves. Above them, inside the walls, came the slow pressure of someone shifting weight from one board to another. The sound moved around the room in a patient circle, stopping once behind the refrigerator, then again above the sink, as though the unseen person were considering the best place to emerge. Neither of them spoke. The dispatcher kept asking questions through the phone, but her voice sounded far away, flattened by distance and static. What happened next was later described differently by everyone involved. The husband would say that he saw fingers curl briefly through the narrow gap between the pantry shelf and the frame, then vanish. The woman insisted she saw an eye looking through one of the tiny drilled holes near the ceiling, calm and unblinking in the flashlight beam. The responding deputies reported finding the shelf open and the hidden route empty once again, though one man privately admitted that he heard movement in the attic after the search had already been called off. The only thing all accounts agreed on was what they found in the bedroom closet. At the back, tucked behind hanging coats they had not unpacked yet, someone had arranged a neat stack of old documents tied with faded ribbon. They were deed fragments, probate copies, tax receipts, letters, and family notes taken from different years, some official and some handwritten. The names on them overlapped, repeated, and contradicted each other. Certain signatures matched no clear transfer. One penciled note, brittle with age, listed household expenses beside the words "still here" written in the margin. Another, much newer, bore no signature at all. It contained only a sentence on lined paper torn from a school notebook. This house was never empty. They left before dawn. The property changed hands again after that, though not quickly. According to later public discussion in the area, contractors sealed the wall voids and demolished part of the rear addition. Some believed they solved the problem. Others said the hidden spaces were too old and too complicated to erase entirely. County records were eventually straightened enough for the title to pass, but local talk never settled. People still mention a house outside town where groceries disappeared from sealed kitchens and dust shifted in attic beams on windless nights. Some say an estranged relative had been living there all along, moving through the walls to protect what she believed was still hers. Some investigators suspected a far sadder explanation, the kind that grows out of generational neglect and family collapse, where a person learns to survive inside the unused parts of a home because there is nowhere else left to go. And some residents, in the slow and careful way country people preserve uncomfortable things, simply say the old place had a watcher in it, someone who remained when families left, someone who learned the house as if it were a body and used its hollows as lungs. Years later, when the story surfaced again in retellings and late-night threads, people argued about what was true. They argued over the legality of the sale, over the missing heirs, over whether fear had magnified ordinary sounds into something monstrous. Yet the detail that stayed with those who heard it was not the hidden mattress or the coffee cup or the bare footprint in the pantry earth. It was the fact that whoever moved through those walls had apparently kept the house in order in small, intimate ways long before the buyers arrived. Windows closed before rain, food wrappers gathered into tidy stacks, old papers preserved, a blanket folded, a cup placed carefully on newspaper so it would not stain the boards, as if the person inside did not think of the place as abandoned at all. As if, in the long confusion of broken deeds and half-finished inheritances, someone had simply gone on, living there quietly, listening through the walls for new footsteps overhead, waiting for strangers to understand that buying a house and possessing it were not always the same thing. A Banff hiker was found days later with no memory of the trail. When the heavy beam of a commercial transport truck cut through the freezing fog along a desolate stretch of Highway 1, it was just past 3 in the morning. The driver had not seen another vehicle for over 40 miles. The surrounding forests of the Canadian Rockies were swallowed by absolute pitch black, pressing in tightly against the narrow ribbon of asphalt. As the truck rounded a sweeping curve, the headlights washed over a lone figure standing precariously close to the white shoulder line. The driver instinctively hit the brakes, the heavy tires hissing against the damp road. The figure was not waving for help. He was a man, standing perfectly rigid, facing the dense and impenetrable tree line rather than the highway. He was shivering violently in a heavy canvas winter coat that was easily 3 sizes too large for his frame. The truck driver, gripped by a sudden and inexplicable sense of dread, did not open his cabin door. Instead, he locked it, rolled his window down just a fraction of an inch, and called the authorities. When the provincial police arrived 20 minutes later, they recognized the shivering man almost immediately from a high-priority missing persons bulletin issued 4 days earlier. He was the experienced mountaineer who had vanished without a trace from a remote alpine trail in Banff National Park, over 130 miles away. But when the officers wrapped a thick blanket around his shoulders and gently asked for his name, the man simply stared through them. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and entirely hollow as he whispered that he was still in the woods. According to the official search and rescue logs, the 32-year-old man had embarked on a carefully planned 3-day solo trek near the rugged Sawback Range. He was not an amateur. He was a seasoned outdoorsman who carried a satellite emergency beacon, detailed topographical maps protected in waterproof casing, and enough high-calorie provisions to comfortably last a week. His detailed itinerary was filed with park rangers, outlining a precise route that followed well-worn valleys and challenging alpine passes. For the first 48 hours of his journey, everything appeared entirely normal. Then, without warning, his satellite beacon ceased transmitting. It did not send a distress signal. The digital ping simply vanished from the monitoring grid at exactly 11:15 p.m. When a specialized search and rescue team finally reached his last known coordinates 2 days later, the scene they discovered left them deeply unsettled. His isolated camp was perfectly intact. His heavy, weatherproof tent was securely pitched beneath a canopy of old-growth pines. His 0-degree sleeping bag was neatly unrolled, and a small, portable camp stove sat cold next to a carefully constructed fire pit. Most disturbing of all were his heavy, mud-caked hiking boots. They were sitting neatly side by side just inside the zippered tent flap. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no aggressive animal tracks, and no scattered gear to indicate panic. The undisturbed scene suggested a deeply unnatural narrative. It looked as though the man had calmly unzipped his tent in the middle of the freezing night, stood up in his thick woolen socks, and walked purposefully out into the sprawling, silent wilderness. Finding the missing hiker alive should have been a moment of profound relief for the rescue teams, but the physical condition in which he was discovered only caused the mystery to deepen into something much darker. The sheer distance between his abandoned campsite and the icy stretch of highway where he was found spanned roughly 130 miles of unforgiving terrain. It was a brutal landscape of jagged, unnamed peaks, deep ravines, and freezing, fast-moving rivers. It was a journey that would have taken a fully equipped, highly trained expedition team over a week to traverse on foot. Yet, the man had seemingly covered that impossible distance in under 4 days. More baffling and deeply disturbing were the bottoms of his feet. Despite leaving his protective boots at the campsite, his bare soles were entirely pristine. There were no deep lacerations from the sharp scree fields, no pine needles embedded in his skin, and no signs of severe frostbite from the freezing alpine temperatures. He had allegedly walked over 100 miles through the harsh Canadian wilderness without shoes, yet his feet looked as though he had been resting indoors. Furthermore, the oversized, stained winter coat he was found wearing bore a faded embroidered logo from a regional logging company. According to public records, that specific logging company had filed for bankruptcy and ceased all operations in 1998. The hiker possessed absolutely no memory of where he acquired the heavy coat, how he crossed the impassable mountain ranges, or why he had abandoned his own shelter. Medical professionals at the regional hospital noted that his physical vitals were bizarrely, almost impossibly stable. He was not suffering from severe dehydration, and his core body temperature and blood sugar levels were entirely within normal limits, heavily suggesting he had eaten and rested recently. But his mind was trapped behind a thick, impenetrable wall of fog. When attending physicians gently pushed him to recount any detail from the last 4 days, his resting heart rate would immediately spike to dangerous, erratic levels. He would squeeze his eyes shut, dig his fingernails into the rigid plastic edges of his hospital bed, and describe an overwhelming sensation of heavy pressure, comparing it to the feeling of being trapped at the lightless bottom of a deep lake. He told attending psychiatrists that the last normal event he could vividly remember was sitting by his unlit campfire around 8 o'clock in the evening, listening to the bitter wind move through the high pine branches. Then, according to his fractured, halting recollections, the wind completely died. He claimed that the natural ambient sounds of the forest, the chirping insects, the rustling underbrush, the distant rush of glacial water all ceased at the exact same moment. In their place came a low, continuous, vibrating hum that seemed to echo from beneath the soil, a sound so deep it made his teeth ache and his vision blur. Hoping to construct a timeline of his movements, investigators retrieved the man's digital camera from the side pocket of his discarded backpack at the campsite. They transported the memory card to a lab, hoping the photographs might provide a rational explanation for his sudden disappearance. The first 30 pictures on the card were entirely unremarkable, showcasing sprawling, sunlit mountain vistas, gray rock faces, and clear blue skies typical of a Banff hiking trip. But the final series of images, captured on the night he vanished, defied any logical explanation. There were exactly 14 photographs taken in rapid, frantic succession at 2:14 in the morning. At first glance, the images were mostly pitch black, violently out of focus, and marred by strange, thick digital artifacts. But as photo analysts slowly adjusted the exposure and contrast levels in a darkened lab, vague, deeply unsettling shapes began to emerge from the digital noise. The massive pine trees in the background appeared heavily distorted, as if the thick wooden trunks were bending at impossible, unnatural angles toward the lens of the camera. In the final 3 photographs, the dense, suffocating canopy of pine needles overhead was faintly illuminated by an unnatural pale gray light that cast no shadows. The distinct, reflective outline of the hiker's tent was nowhere to be seen in any of the frames. Digital metadata extracted from the files indicated that these final photos were captured deep within a valley nearly 20 miles away from where the physical camera was actually found. The hiker remained in a secure psychiatric ward under close medical observation for over 2 weeks. During that extended period, his missing memories did not naturally return, but highly specific, disturbing behavioral tics began to surface. Night shift nurses reported in their charts that the man would wake from a dead sleep at exactly 2:14 in the morning every single night, without fail. He would immediately pull his knees tightly to his chest, press the palms of his hands fiercely over his ears, and stare blankly at the acoustic ceiling tiles. When a night orderly once cautiously approached and asked him what was wrong, the man did not look away from the ceiling. He merely whispered that the trees outside the window were too quiet and that the sky behind the clouds was the wrong color. During his daily therapy sessions, he claimed that during his lost days, he had walked through a sprawling, ancient forest where the shadows cast by the trees did not match the position of the sun. He spoke in a monotone voice about a hidden valley that did not exist on any topographical map, a place where the jagged rocks felt strangely warm to the bare touch, and the stagnant air smelled heavily of ozone and burning copper. He adamantly insisted that he had not walked the 130 miles to the highway. Instead, he claimed the dark woods had simply shifted and rotated around him, rearranging their geography in an endless maze until they finally spat him out onto the cold asphalt. The most deeply unsettling revelation came during a routine cognitive mapping test in his 3rd week of observation. A specialist asked the man to draw a simple map of his planned route on a large sheet of paper, hoping the physical, repetitive act of tracing his steps might unlock a suppressed memory fragment. The hiker calmly took the black pen and began to sketch the Sawback Range with surprising, practiced accuracy. He drew the winding trail, the river crossings, and the exact location of his final campsite. But as his pen reached the perimeter of the camp, his hand began to tremble violently. He drew a tight, jagged, aggressive circle around the campsite. He pressed the ballpoint pen down so hard that the thick paper tore, furiously filling the circle with dense, chaotic scribbles of black ink until the pen ran dry. When the specialist carefully asked him what the dark void represented, the man stopped drawing entirely. His breathing grew terribly shallow. He looked up, his eyes hollow, exhausted, and filled with a profound terror, and stated softly that it was the place where the geography finally ran out. He told her that on that night, he had walked a few yards into the trees to investigate a strange, metallic sound, but when he turned around to go back to the safety of his tent, the trail was simply gone. It was not hidden by brush or darkness, it was completely erased from the earth. He said he kept walking in a straight line for what felt like years, but the massive tree trunks merely repeated themselves, forming an endless, looping corridor of identical bark and dead silence, trapped beneath a flat sky that held absolutely no stars. To this day, the bizarre case remains officially classified by the authorities as a severe incident of temporary dissociative amnesia, likely brought on by exposure to the elements or an acute psychological break. The investigative file was quietly closed, with officials concluding that the man must have somehow hitched a ride on a private logging road to cover the impossible physical distance, despite the glaring fact that no driver ever came forward and his feet bore no signs of travel. The hiker never returned to the Canadian Rockies. According to distant relatives, he relocated to a flat, arid desert region in the American Southwest, choosing a home miles away from any large trees or heavy foliage. But the veteran park rangers who patrol the deep, isolated valleys of Banff still whisper about the abandoned campsite near the Sawback Range. They say that on certain still, moonless nights, the natural, comforting sounds of the alpine woods simply drop away without warning, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating, and unnatural silence. And those who intimately know the persistent legend of the lost hiker know better than to step off the marked trail in the dark, driven by a quiet, lingering fear that the ancient trees might quietly close in behind them, leading them into a silent space where time, distance, and memory simply cease to exist. The Butcher of Kingsbury Run. During the bleakest years of the Great Depression, the city of Cleveland, Ohio, was a place defined by towering industrial smokestacks and grinding poverty. Beneath the iron bridges and roaring tracks of the Erie Railroad lay a jagged, overgrown ravine known as Kingsbury Run. It was a miserable scar of earth choked with soot, weeds, and the constant bitter wind coming off Lake Erie. For the thousands of transient men and women riding the rails looking for work, Kingsbury Run offered a desperate sanctuary. It was a sprawling shantytown of makeshift tents, cardboard shacks, and forgotten souls. It was a place where desperate people came to disappear, and in the shadows of the 1930s, someone realized that it was also the perfect place to hunt. The horror began subtly, with a grim discovery on the shores of Lake Erie in September of 1934. The lower half of a woman's torso washed up on the sand. The skin was strange, tough, and discolored, treated with an unidentified chemical that burned the flesh to the texture of leather. Her head was never found, her identity remained a ghost. She became known only as the Lady of the Lake, an isolated tragedy in a city numb to misfortune. But she was not an isolated incident. She was the prologue to a macabre tapestry of violence that would soon paralyze the entire region. In September of 1935, two teenage boys were walking through the tangled weeds of Kingsbury Run when they stumbled upon a nightmare. Hidden in the brush were the bodies of two men. One was later identified as Edward Andrassy, a 28-year-old drifter known to frequent the dangerous edges of the city. The other man remained nameless. Both victims had been completely emasculated. Both had been cleanly, deliberately decapitated. The horror of Kingsbury Run did not lie in chaotic violence, but in the chilling clinical silence of the aftermath. When the medical examiners analyzed the remains, they discovered something that sent a wave of absolute dread through the police department. The bodies had been drained entirely of blood. The decapitations were not the frenzied hacking of a madman in an alleyway. They were precise surgical disarticulations of the cervical vertebrae. The killer had taken his time. He possessed undeniable anatomical knowledge. Even more terrifying was the logistical reality of the crime. To hang a human being upside down, bleed them completely dry without leaving a trace at the dump site, and sever their limbs with such immaculate precision required a private, secure location. It required a slaughterhouse. Somewhere in the crowded, bustling city of Cleveland, a butcher was operating a secret laboratory of death. As the months bled into 1936, the nightmare escalated. The killer preyed on the invisible class of society, the drifters, sex workers, and runaway teenagers whose absences would go unrecorded by the authorities. Parts of bodies began appearing in horrifying configurations across the city. Florence Polillo, a woman who lived on the margins, was found carefully dismembered, her limbs wrapped tightly in old newspapers and packed into baskets. In the summer of that same year, the headless body of a transient was found near the railroad tracks. Even with 6 distinct, elaborate tattoos across his skin, nobody stepped forward to claim him. He became known simply as the Tattooed Man, another nameless specimen on the killer's slab. The butcher of Kingsbury Run began to taunt the city. He scattered the pieces of his victims in plain sight. Heads were found wrapped in burlap sacks, abandoned under bridges. Torsos were discovered floating in the murky, polluted waters of the Cuyahoga River. Some remains showed signs of extreme hesitation and jagged cuts, while others displayed the smooth, confident slices of a master surgeon. Sometimes the bodies were scrubbed immaculate, devoid of any hair or debris. The sheer physical strength required to transport a heavy, dead torso down the steep, muddy embankments of the ravine in the dead of night was staggering. The killer was a phantom, moving unseen through the smoke and fog, carrying his gruesome cargo right under the noses of the citizens. The terror reached such a fever pitch that the city turned to a legend for salvation. Eliot Ness, the famous federal agent who had famously battled Al Capone in Chicago, had recently been appointed as Cleveland's safety director. Ness brought a reputation of untouchable justice, vowing to clean up the corruption and the crime that choked the city's streets. But the butcher did not operate in the world of organized crime. He did not care about badges, headlines, or the law. He operated in a dark, primal realm that the brilliant detective could not penetrate. Ness threw the full weight of his authority at the case. He organized massive sweeps of the shantytowns, detectives interviewed thousands of citizens, fingerprints were taken from transients, and the plaster death masks of the unidentified victims were displayed in public exhibitions, their vacant eyes pleading with the crowds for a name. But the silence remained absolute. The killer left no fingerprints, no murder weapons, and no witnesses. The roaring trains of the Erie Railroad swallowed any screams, and the soot of Kingsbury Run buried any footprints. By August of 1938, the butcher's confidence mutated into pure arrogance. In a silent, devastating declaration of supremacy, the killer deposited the dismembered remains of 2 victims in a trash dump located directly in the line of sight of Eliot Ness's office window. It was a personal insult. It was a message written in human remains, proving that no matter how powerful the law believed itself to be, the butcher owned the shadows of Cleveland. Driven to the edge of despair and realizing he was fighting an invisible monster, Ness made a controversial and desperate decision. He determined that if he could not catch the predator, he would destroy the hunting ground. In the early hours of the morning, just days after the final bodies were discovered, Ness led a massive police raid into the heart of Kingsbury Run. Officers dragged the freezing, terrified vagrants from their makeshift homes, forcing them out of the ravine. Then, under Ness's direct orders, they poured kerosene over the tents, the shacks, and the garbage. They struck matches. The resulting inferno consumed Kingsbury Run. Flames leapt into the smog-choked sky, burning the shantytown to ash. It was a heavy-handed, brutal act that displaced hundreds of destitute people who had nowhere else to go. The fire sterilized the ravine, turning the sprawling encampment into a smoldering, blackened wasteland. It was an act of profound frustration, the desperate thrashing of a lawman who had finally met an evil he could not arrest. The burning of Kingsbury Run marked the end of the official murders. The headless bodies stopped appearing in the weeds, but the closure was an illusion. The butcher was never caught. The city's primary suspect was an incredibly intelligent, deeply disturbed surgeon with a history of severe mental instability. Ness interrogated the doctor relentlessly in a hotel room for days, pushing for a confession, but the evidence was entirely circumstantial. Knowing the law could not touch him without proof, the surgeon voluntarily committed himself to an asylum, placing himself safely beyond the reach of the police. From the quiet security of his institutionalized life, he allegedly spent the next several years sending cryptic, mocking postcards to Eliot Ness, ensuring the famous detective would never forget his ultimate failure. The Great Depression eventually faded, and the ashes of Kingsbury Run were swallowed by modern development. But the heavy, suffocating dread of the unsolved case never truly lifted from the city. Out of 12 officially recognized victims, only 2 were ever definitively identified. The rest remained nameless, their meticulously severed remains buried in potter's fields. Somewhere in the 1930s, a man with the hands of a surgeon and the mind of a monster packed up his secret laboratory and walked quietly back into society, taking the answers with him. All that remains are the plaster casts of the forgotten faces, staring blindly from archive shelves, forever waiting for the names that the butcher took away. In the Nahanni Valley, locals still avoid one section of the river. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police Patrol found the camp at twilight, nestled in a deep, shadowed bend of the South Nahanni River. It was the autumn of 1908. The fire ring had been cold for weeks, the ashes washed flat by heavy rains, supplies were stacked neatly beside a thick canvas tent, sacks of flour and dried beans sat entirely untouched, while expensive gold prospecting equipment was laid out methodically in the damp moss. But what caused the officers to draw their rifles and step back into the shadows was not the abandoned gear, it was the shape lying just beyond the tree line. Wrapped in heavy winter furs, the body of a man was strapped tightly to a wooden sled. His hands were securely bound, and his head was entirely missing. This discovery would become the first official record of a mystery that would stain the remote Canadian wilderness for over a century. The Nahanni River carves a violent path through the Northwest Territories, surrounded by limestone walls that rise thousands of feet into the sky. It is a place of staggering beauty and extreme hostility. Deep within the canyons, geothermal hot springs heat the frozen earth, creating bizarre tropical microclimates where rare plants bloom in the dead of winter. Thick, sulfurous white fog constantly bleeds from these vents, rolling across the forest floor and swallowing the landscape in an impenetrable veil. To the indigenous Dene people who have lived on the borders of this wilderness for thousands of years, the valley was not a place of refuge. It was a place to be avoided at all costs. The body found tied to the sled belonged to one of the McLeod brothers, Willie and Frank, 2 prospectors who had ventured into the canyon 3 years earlier in search of a legendary lost gold mine. According to reports, the brothers had ignored the warnings of local guides who spoke of an evil presence dwelling deep within the mist. When the search party eventually located the second brother a short distance from the camp, his remains mirrored the first. His head was also gone. Police reports from the time noted that the camp showed no signs of a struggle. There were no scattered belongings, no torn canvas, and no defensive wounds on the bodies. It was as if whatever had come for them had done so with calm, methodical precision. Investigators initially blamed the grim condition of the bodies on scavenging animals, suggesting that bears or wolves had carried off the skulls. But seasoned trappers in the region pointed out the terrifying inconsistencies in this theory. Animals do not bind a man's hands. They do not strap a body to a sled. And scavengers do not selectively remove a human head while leaving the rest of the body, along with the camp's entire food supply, completely untouched. A deep unease settled over the local trading posts. The area quickly earned a dark nickname among prospectors and trappers, a name it still holds today. They called it the Valley of the Headless Men. For nearly a decade, the canyons remained largely empty. The harsh winters and the lingering fear kept most outsiders away, but the lure of untouched gold is a powerful force. In 1917, a rugged Swiss prospector named Martin Jorgensen decided to test his luck in the valley. He was an experienced woodsman, well-equipped to handle the brutal subarctic conditions. For months, he seemed to thrive. He built a sturdy log cabin near the riverbank, occasionally sending word back to civilization that he had struck a rich vein of gold. He wrote that he had found his fortune and that he planned to stay in the valley until the following spring. But spring came and Jorgensen never emerged from the canyon. A group of travelers passing through the area noticed a column of dark smoke rising from the deep woods. When they investigated, they found Jorgensen's cabin burned to its stone foundations. The heavy logs had been reduced to smoldering embers. Among the ashes, they discovered his skeleton. His rifle was found a few feet away, fully loaded and unfired. And just like the McLeod brothers before him, Jorgensen's skull was nowhere to be found. The gold he had claimed to discover was missing entirely. The silence that surrounded the burned cabin offered no clues. There were no tracks leading away from the ruins, only the quiet rush of the Nahanni River echoing off the canyon walls. The pattern was too specific to ignore. Rumors began to spread wildly through the Northern Territories. Some believed that a hostile, uncontacted tribe lived deep in the mountains, violently protecting the valley's gold. Others whispered about the Naha, a mythical, fierce tribe from local folklore that was said to dwell in the high peaks, descending only to slaughter those who trespassed. But the indigenous guides insisted the Naha had vanished without a trace centuries ago. The elders warned that the threat in the valley was not a tribe of men. They spoke of evil spirits, of massive creatures that walked upright in the fog, and of an ancient sickness that infected the very soil of the canyon. Despite the grim history, the valley claimed another victim in 1945. An Ontario miner named Ernest Savard was found dead near his camp in the same region. His body was discovered inside his heavy sleeping bag, zipped up tightly against the freezing night air. He had not been burned, nor had he been bound, but the result was the same. His head had been cleanly removed, and it was missing from the campsite. The police investigation concluded with no suspects and no explanation. The sheer isolation of the area made it impossible to secure a crime scene or track down leads. Whoever or whatever was responsible for the mutilations had thousands of square miles of dense, unforgiving wilderness to hide in. By the late 1960s, the era of the lone gold prospector had largely ended, replaced by organized expeditions and recreational adventurers. A group of 4 experienced outdoorsmen traveled to the valley, determined to navigate the treacherous rapids of the Nahanni River. They were well aware of the legends, viewing them as campfire ghost stories meant to scare away tourists. They set up camp on a wide gravel riverbank, surrounded by towering spruce trees and the ever-present sulfur mist from the nearby hot springs. The evening was uneventful. They cooked their food, secured their supplies in bear-proof containers, and retired to their individual tents as the temperature plummeted. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, one of the men awoke to a strange sensation. He later described it to authorities as a feeling of immense atmospheric pressure, a sudden heaviness in the air that made it difficult to breathe. The ambient noise of the wilderness had completely vanished. The wind had stopped howling through the canyon. Even the rushing sound of the river seemed muffled, as if wrapped in thick cotton. He lay awake in his sleeping bag, listening intently to the unnatural silence. Then he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a heavy, wet, dragging noise, moving slowly over the smooth river stones just outside his tent. It sounded like a massive wet sack being pulled across the gravel. The dragging was accompanied by a low, rhythmic thud like the footsteps of something unbelievably heavy. The man held his breath, clutching his hunting knife, too paralyzed by fear to unzip his tent. The dragging sound stopped right beside the thin nylon wall of his shelter. He could hear a deep, ragged exhalation, a breathing so loud and guttural it vibrated in his chest. A foul stench leaked into the tent, smelling of rotten meat and stagnant swamp water. The creature, or person, stood there in the absolute dark for what felt like an eternity. Then, the heavy footsteps slowly moved away, retreating toward the edge of the forest. The man did not sleep the rest of the night. He lay frozen, waiting for the sun to rise. When dawn finally broke, casting a pale gray light through the mist, he emerged from his tent. The camp looked completely normal. The bear-proof containers were untouched, the fire pit was undisturbed. But when he looked toward the tent of his friend, who had been sleeping closest to the tree line, he noticed the flap was hanging wide open. He walked over and looked inside. His friend was gone. His heavy hiking boots were still sitting neatly by the entrance, his winter coat was draped over his backpack, but his sleeping bag and the man inside it had vanished. The remaining 3 men desperately searched the perimeter of the camp. Near the edge of the dense spruce trees, they found a wide path of crushed vegetation, as if something incredibly heavy had been dragged directly into the forest. They followed the trail for nearly a mile, shouting their friend's name into the thick, sulfurous fog. They received no answer. The tracks eventually disappeared at the edge of a sheer cliff face, dropping hundreds of feet into a jagged ravine. Hanging from a branch near the edge, nearly 10 feet off the ground, they found a torn, bloody piece of a nylon sleeping bag. A massive search operation was launched in the following days. Search and rescue teams scoured the canyon, utilizing helicopters and tracker dogs. The dogs were brought to the edge of the woods where the sleeping bag was found, but according to the handlers, the animals panicked. They whined, tucked their tails, and absolutely refused to enter the tree line. The search lasted for 2 weeks, but not a single trace of the missing camper was ever found. He was eventually declared dead, another tragic victim of the unforgiving Nahanni wilderness. The official report cited an animal attack, likely a massive grizzly bear, though no bear tracks were ever identified near the camp. Over the years, strange reports have continued to leak out of the valley. Pilots flying small float planes low over the canyons have reported experiencing sudden, inexplicable compass failures and electrical malfunctions. Some have sworn they saw massive, dark silhouettes standing entirely still in the fog, figures that looked vaguely human but were far too large. Hikers who stray too close to the hot springs often report the sudden, overpowering stench of rotting meat, followed by the distinct sound of heavy bipedal footsteps shadowing them from just out of sight. The feeling of being hunted is so intense that many turn back before completing their journey. Today, the Nahanni National Park Reserve is a protected area. Visitors are strictly regulated, and deep ventures into the canyons require specialized permits. Park rangers warn every group to stick together, to keep their campsites clean, and to never wander away from the firelight alone. But despite modern equipment, satellite phones, and global positioning systems, the valley remains an isolated, silent world of its own. The steep limestone walls block communication signals, and the sudden, violent weather changes can ground rescue helicopters for days. If you find yourself in trouble out there, you are entirely on your own. Some investigators still believe there is a rational explanation for the history of severed heads and vanished campers. They point to the extreme psychological toll of total isolation, suggesting that cabin fever or mercury poisoning from mining operations drove men to murder each other in gruesome ways. They argue that scavengers simply finished the job, carrying away the skulls. But these logical theories provide little comfort to those who have actually stood in the deep shadows of the canyon, listening to the wind howl through the rocks, watching the thick white fog pour out of the earth. The mystery of the valley remains a dark, open wound in the history of the Canadian North. The remains of Willie and Frank McLeod, Martin Jorgensen, and Ernest Savard were eventually buried, their case files gathering dust in forgotten archives. The gold they were searching for was never recovered. The indigenous locals continue to pass down the ancient warnings, refusing to camp near the haunted sections of the river. They know that the sheer, towering walls of the canyon keep secrets hidden perfectly in the dark. There is a stretch of the South Nahanni River where the water grows strangely calm, and the sulfur mist hangs so thick you cannot see the opposite bank. The silence there is heavy, almost suffocating, broken only by the occasional sound of rocks tumbling down the distant cliffs. If you stand by the water's edge at twilight, When the shadows stretch long across the gravel, you might hear a low, wet, dragging sound coming from the trees. According to those who know the legends, it is best not to turn your flashlight toward the noise. Whatever took the heads of the prospectors over a century ago never left the valley. It is still out there, hiding in the fog, waiting patiently for the fire to burn out. The ashes of the Sodder children. The Appalachian Mountains in late December hold a very specific kind of cold. It is a damp, biting chill that seeps through the wooden floorboards of old houses and settles deep into the marrow of the people who live there. In the small, quiet town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, the night of Christmas Eve in the year 1945 was meant to be one of warmth and chaotic joy. The Sodder family home, a large two-story timber house situated on a quiet stretch of road, was overflowing with life. George and Jenny Sodder, Italian immigrants who had built a comfortable life and a respectable hauling business, were raising 9 of their 10 children under that roof, their eldest son away serving in the military. It was a house full of noise, laughter, and the bright, frantic anticipation of Christmas morning. But the dense woods surrounding the property were silent, hiding secrets in the deep shadows that stretched toward the porch. To understand the nightmare that consumed the Sodder family, one must first look at the shadows that had been gathering around them in the months prior. George Sodder was a man of strong convictions. He was openly opposed to the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini, a stance that had earned him quiet enemies within the local immigrant community. The animosity was not just whispered, it had materialized on his doorstep. Earlier that fall, a visiting life insurance salesman, enraged by George's political arguments, had pointed a trembling finger at the house and sworn that it would go up in smoke and that George's children would be destroyed. A few weeks later, a drifter looking for work had wandered onto the property, staring intently at the fuse boxes on the side of the house. The man had casually remarked that the wiring would cause a fire someday, a strange comment considering George had recently had the entire electrical system inspected and deemed perfectly safe by the local power company. These were easily dismissed as empty threats or the rambling of strangers, but in the desolate quiet of a winter night, isolated in the mountains, threats have a way of taking root. The evening of December 24th began with the mundane comforts of the holidays. 5 of the younger children, 14-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha, 9-year-old Louis, 8-year-old Jenny, and 5-year-old Betty begged their mother to stay up past their bedtime to play with the new toys they had opened early. Jenny agreed, under the condition that they remember to feed the cows and close the chicken coops before they finally went to sleep. She took her youngest baby upstairs, leaving the 5 children in the warm glow of the living room, while 2 older boys had already gone up to their attic bedroom to sleep. The house was peaceful, the wood stove crackled, but the peace was an illusion. At exactly 12:30 a.m., the sharp, mechanical shrill of the telephone shattered the silence. In a house that large, the sudden ringing in the dead of night was jarring. Jenny pulled herself out of bed and walked downstairs into the dark hallway to answer it. When she lifted the heavy receiver to her ear, she was greeted by an unfamiliar woman's voice asking for a name Jenny did not recognize. But it was not the mistake that unsettled her, it was the ambient noise bleeding through the earpiece. Behind the woman's voice, Jenny could hear the distinct clinking of crystal glasses and the sound of raucous, unsettling laughter. It was a hollow, eerie sound that seemed to lack any genuine mirth. Jenny told the woman she had the wrong number. The woman offered a strange, chilling chuckle before the line clicked dead. As Jenny turned away from the phone, a creeping sense of unease washed over her. She noticed that the lights downstairs were still burning brightly, the curtains were wide open to the blackness outside, and the heavy wooden front door was completely unlocked. Her daughter Marion had fallen asleep on the living room sofa, but the other 5 children who had begged to stay up were nowhere to be seen. Assuming they had simply forgotten their chores and quietly crept upstairs to their beds in the attic, Jenny locked the door, turned out the lights, and returned to her room, trying to shake the lingering echo of that phantom laughter. At 1 o'clock in the morning, the silence of the house was broken again. This time, it was a physical impact. Jenny was startled awake by the distinct, heavy thud of an object striking the roof of the house right above her head. It was followed by a strange rolling noise, like a hard ball of heavy rubber skipping down the slanted shingles. She held her breath in the dark, waiting for another sound. Nothing came. She closed her eyes, trying to force herself back to sleep. 30 minutes later, at 1:30 a.m., the true horror began. Jenny woke again, coughing. The air in the bedroom was thick and sharp with the acrid scent of burning wood and melting rubber. She threw open her bedroom door and was met with a wall of suffocating black smoke billowing up from the first floor. The fire was roaring violently near the office, right by the fuse boxes and the telephone line. Panic, pure and primal, took over. She screamed for George. They grabbed the baby, while Marion and the two older boys from the attic stumbled through the smoke to join them. They burst through the front doors into the freezing December air, gasping for breath, expecting the rest of the children to be right behind them. They stood barefoot in the snow, the biting wind whipping around them, and turned back to the house. The glow of the flames was growing brighter, casting long, dancing shadows into the woods. But Maurice, Martha, Louis, little Jenny, and Betty were not outside. George, adrenaline flooding his veins, rushed back toward the burning house. He shattered a window, cutting his arm to the bone, but the entire downstairs staircase was a roaring wall of fire. He could not get up to the attic. He screamed their names into the inferno, but the only response was the deafening crackle of burning timber. This is the moment the incident twisted from a tragic accident into a labyrinth of psychological terror. George realized he could climb to the attic windows from the outside. He ran to the side of the house to grab the heavy wooden ladder that had leaned against the same wall for years. It was gone. He frantically searched the dark yard, blood dripping from his arm into the snow. The ladder had vanished. It would not be found until hours later, discarded in a steep ditch nearly 75 feet away from the house. Desperate, George ran to the heavy coal trucks parked in the driveway. He planned to drive one directly against the house and climb onto the cab to reach his trapped children. He threw open the door of the first truck, cranked the ignition, and pressed the gas. The engine whined, but refused to turn over. He sprinted to the second truck, sliding behind the wheel, turning the key. Dead. Both massive engines, which had run perfectly the afternoon before, were completely immobilized. As the fire raged on, someone realized the rain barrels used for extinguishing small fires were frozen solid. A daughter ran through the dark to a neighbor's house to call the fire department, but the operator did not answer. It was later discovered that the Sodders' own telephone line had not been burned by the fire, it had been intentionally severed at the very top of the pole. George and Jenny were forced to stand in the snow and watch their home burn. They watched the flames consume the second floor. They listened with agonizing dread for the screams of their 5 children. But there were no screams, there was no sound of panic from the attic windows, just the roaring fire and the silent, impenetrable wall of the Appalachian woods staring back at them. By the time the sun rose on Christmas morning, the massive house was nothing more than a shallow, smoking basement of gray ash and glowing embers. The local fire chief, delayed by a severe lack of manpower, did not arrive until 8 o'clock in the morning. When the embers finally cooled enough to be searched, the police and fire crews began sifting through the rubble. They were looking for 5 small bodies. They found melted household appliances. They found fragments of a tin roof. They found the twisted metal of the wood stove, but they did not find a single human bone. It is a scientific impossibility for a typical wood-framed house fire to completely vaporize human skeletons. A house fire burns at roughly 1200 degrees Fahrenheit for an hour or two. A professional crematorium must burn at 2000 degrees Fahrenheit for multiple hours, and even then, large fragments of bone remain behind to be manually ground into ash. The idea that 5 distinct human skeletons were reduced to absolutely nothing but gray dust in a brief residential fire defies the laws of physics. The searchers sifted the dirt, they dragged rakes through the soot. There was no flesh, no skulls, no teeth, nothing. This missing evidence birthed a psychological horror far worse than grief: eternal uncertainty. If the children did not die in the fire, where did they go? The realization crept into George and Jenny's minds like a slow-acting poison. The cut telephone wire, the missing ladder dragged into the dark, the engines of the trucks expertly disabled in the dead of winter, the strange woman laughing on the phone just an hour before the flames broke out. The fire was not a malfunction, it was a calculated distraction. As the years bled into decades, the surviving Sodders rebuilt their lives in the shadow of that empty, ash-filled crater. They erected a massive billboard on Route 16, displaying the faces of their 5 missing children, begging for answers that would never come. The true horror of that Christmas Eve was not just the fire, but the absolute chilling certainty that they were not alone in the dark that night. Someone had been watching. Someone had crept onto their property, disabled their lifelines, and ignited their home. And while George and Jenny screamed into the inferno, someone was likely standing deep in the freezing tree line, watching the parents suffer, while 5 children were swallowed whole by the Appalachian night, never to be seen again. The case that was closed too quickly in Ohio. By the time the deputy reached the gravel pull-off above the creek, the flashlight beams were already moving over the reeds, and someone down in the dark was saying that the girl had been found on her back, not face down, and that her coat was folded beside her as if she had stopped there willingly. Before sunrise, that detail would begin to disappear. By noon, it would be gone from the official version entirely. The town sat low in the southern hills of Ohio, in that part of the state where the roads bent around old mines, churchyards, and patches of woods that never seemed to thin, even in winter. People there remembered sounds more than dates. A train at midnight, dogs barking toward the river, a screen door opening where no one should have been. The investigation began in one of those cold months when the fields turned colorless and every yard looked abandoned after dusk. She was in her early 20s, according to the reports that circulated first, and she had last been seen leaving a roadside place just outside town after the late shift. The usual pieces appeared quickly. A car left where it should not have been, a phone that stopped answering, a family that began calling before the county was ready to call it an emergency. Early newspaper accounts, the kind written fast and half from rumor, described a scene that did not match the conclusion that came later. One article mentioned marks on the slope above the creek, as if something heavy had been dragged through the frosted grass. Another said the first officer on scene believed there had been more than one person there. A radio bulletin, repeated for less than a day and then never again, stated that the body had been located several yards from the waterline, not in it, and that the victim's shoes were unusually clean for someone who had slipped down a muddy bank in the dark. Those reports were not formal evidence. They were only early fragments gathered in haste, but in small towns, the first version of an event leaves a stain. It does not wash out easily. The official explanation settled over everything with surprising speed. It was not dramatic, that was part of its strength. She had become disoriented, the public was told. There was poor visibility. The creek had risen. Exposure and water had done the rest. There was no confirmed sign of assault, no confirmed sign of abduction, no clear reason to keep the county awake much longer than it already had been. What had begun as a tense search narrowed into paperwork, then signatures, then silence. People who had spent the first day whispering in parking lots stopped whispering, not because the questions had been answered, but because the answer had already been chosen. And yet, the first detective assigned to the file did not seem convinced, at least not at once. Years later, when portions of the case papers were discussed by local researchers and former reporters, certain details stood out for the way they resisted the final summary. There was a notation about a back door in a nearby vacant property being found unlatched. There was mention of a broken drinking glass on a kitchen floor inside that same structure, despite no public statement ever linking the girl to the building. There was also a line, brief and badly typed, recording that a witness on the Ridge Road had heard a vehicle idling there sometime after midnight, long after the restaurants and gas stations had gone dark. That witness later seemed to vanish from the public record altogether. The vacant property became the part of the story that older residents still lowered their voices over. It was not a notorious place, only an old house left to weather at the edge of a field, with one leaning porch post and a front room that took on the smell of wet plaster every autumn. Teenagers had gone there now and then, hunters cut across the back lot. Nothing about it suggested a legend, at least not before the investigation touched it. But according to people who later claimed to have seen the early scene notes, there had been signs of recent movement inside. Mud on one stretch of floorboards and nowhere else. A chair pulled toward the window facing the road, a coat button that did not match the victim's clothes. Most troubling of all was a short sentence in an evidence inventory that referred to audio material recovered from rear bedroom. No description followed it. No transcript was attached. In the final case packet, that item was no longer there. Those omissions might have been clerical. Papers are misplaced, inventories are corrected, small departments are not always careful in the first frantic hours of a case. But the pattern ran deeper than a single missing item. A local reporter who kept copies of the earliest clippings noticed that the location of the body shifted from one account to the next. In one version, she had been found near the water, as though she had stumbled. In another, she had been found in a shallow depression above the bank where the frost had not yet melted around her hair. One report said her hands were bare, another said one glove was tucked into the pocket of her coat. The coat itself moved through the story in an even stranger way, folded, torn, missing, recovered later. There was never one stable description. It was as though the physical facts of the scene had been gradually pressed into a shape that better suited the conclusion. The family, according to public statements and later recollections, did not stop asking for a clearer explanation. They questioned the speed of the ruling. They questioned why some early comments from investigators had been softened or withdrawn. They questioned how a young woman could leave a lit parking lot, travel a route no one could map with confidence, and end up in a place that several officers initially treated as suspicious, only for that suspicion to evaporate within days. None of that proves foul play. It does not prove anything at all. But the unease came from the movement of the story itself. Facts usually grow firmer with time. In this case, they seem to grow softer, blurred at the edges, as if each revision had been made not to sharpen the truth, but to make it less difficult to live with. Then there was the call. It appeared in some retellings and vanished in others, which only made it worse. According to discussions that surfaced years afterward, a 911 call came in during the hours before the body was found. The caller did not give a name. There was either breathing on the line or wind. Different people remembered it differently. One former dispatcher reportedly said a woman had tried to speak but stopped. Another version claimed there were two sounds, one close to the receiver and one farther back, like a chair scraping a floor. The call was not treated publicly as central to the case, and no complete recording has ever been widely released. Still, one reference to a distressed open line lingered in an internal log summary. It was time-stamped well after the victim had last been seen, and close enough to the discovery of the body to trouble anyone who noticed it. The most unsettling part was not that the call existed, but that it sat beside a note suggesting the phone later recovered with the victim showed water exposure so severe that investigators were uncertain whether it could have been used during that window at all. That contradiction was never fully explained in public. Perhaps the call came from someone else, perhaps the timing was off, perhaps a deputy wrote down the wrong device. Those are ordinary possibilities. But the file did not read like a file that had encountered an ordinary mistake and corrected it. It read like a file that had stepped around certain facts and left them behind in the dark. A retired clerk from the courthouse, speaking years later to someone collecting local case histories, described the folder itself in a way that people in town still repeated. She said it felt thinner than it should have. She said there were places where pages had clearly once been fastened together and no longer were. She remembered an evidence sheet with item numbers continuing in sequence until one line, where a space had been left large enough for several words and then crossed through with a single pen stroke. She could not recall what had been written there first. She only remembered that the ink used to strike it out was darker and newer than the type on the rest of the page. That is a small thing. It might mean nothing. In a room full of old files, almost everything looks altered, but the image stayed with people because it fit too neatly with the rest of the case. Not destroyed, not solved, only adjusted. As the years passed, the town did what small towns do with unresolved stories. It set them down in layers. The older generation spoke about carelessness, favoritism, and officials who wanted the matter finished before it stained the county too deeply. Younger people added a different edge. They talked about the empty house, they talked about the rear bedroom and the missing audio. Some said a hunter had once gone inside there at dusk and found old police tape in a dresser drawer, though no one ever proved it. Others claimed that if a car stopped on the ridge road after midnight and the engine was cut, the creek below sounded wrong, not like moving water, but like somebody dragging a wet bundle through weeds. No one sensible called that evidence. It was only a rumor, the kind that grows where documents go silent. Still, there was one detail even the skeptics found difficult to shake. In one early photograph, reproduced badly in a local archive before access tightened, the vacant house could be seen in the background beyond the tree line. Its rear window reflected the morning in a flat, pale square. At first glance, there was nothing there. But a former reporter, looking closely years later, believed there was a shape at the glass. Not a face exactly, more like someone standing a step back from the window and watching the search below. The image quality was poor. It could have been curtain, glare, damage to the print. Yet that same reporter said the original contact sheet for the scene later seemed incomplete, with one frame missing between two shots taken seconds apart. He never proved that either. He only said that every time he tried to trace the sequence, the records broke apart in his hands. The county moved on, the house collapsed by degrees, the field behind it grew up wild, new deputies came in who knew the story only as something older officers dismissed with a tired look. Officially, nothing remained open. There was no murder to solve, no abductor to identify, no conspiracy waiting under the surface of public record. There was only a young woman whose death had been explained, and a town that did not quite believe the explanation it had been given. In daylight, that seemed manageable. At church suppers and football games, people spoke of other things. But on winter nights, when the roads emptied early and the hills held their breath, the old contradictions came back with the dark. Some said the worst part was how ordinary the file sounded if read quickly. It did not shout. It did not confess. It offered no final revelation hidden in a margin. It simply failed in a few quiet places to line up with itself. A coat where it should not have been. Shoes too clean for the bank. A house entered and then forgotten. An item of audio recovered and then no longer mentioned. A call that arrived from nowhere and settled nowhere. These were not answers. They were absences shaped like answers, and that was what made the case endure. An unsolved crime can be named, an accident can be mourned, but a story that has been gently pressed into the wrong shape leaves behind a different kind of fear, one with no edge to hold. Long after the papers were boxed away, there were people in that part of southern Ohio who still slowed when they passed the old pull-off above the creek. They did it without meaning to. They looked down through the brush, past the black water and the low tangle of branches, toward the place where the first flashlights moved before dawn and the first version of the truth had briefly shown itself. Then they drove on, back toward the lit houses and the gas stations and the safer explanations. But the feeling stayed with them. Not that something supernatural had happened there, not even that the town had uncovered a monster and hidden it, only that somewhere in the first hours, before the signatures and the final ruling, somebody had seen one detail too many. And that detail had been trimmed away so the rest could close around it. What remained was smaller than a haunting and colder than a legend. It was the possibility that the most disturbing thing in the file had never been the death at all, but the care with which certain parts of it had been made to disappear. The phantom vehicles of Route 491. There is a stretch of asphalt that bleeds through the Four Corners region of the American Southwest, a desolate ribbon cutting across the Navajo Nation. It is a place of striking, barren beauty by day, characterized by jagged red rock formations and oceans of pale sagebrush. But when the sun drops below the horizon, the landscape changes. The temperature plummets, shadows stretch into unnatural shapes, and the isolation becomes absolute. This is Route 491. For nearly 8 decades, however, it carried a different designation, one that seemed to infect the very earth beneath the pavement. It was known as Route 666, the Devil's Highway. Commissioned in 1926 as the 6th spur of the legendary Route 66, the highway was burdened with a numeric association that immediately cast a shadow over its creation. For years, engineers and locals alike brushed off the designation as a mere administrative coincidence, but the road quickly earned a reputation soaked in blood and unexplained terror. The accident statistics on that endless, straight stretch of desert highway were consistently impossibly high. Fatalities occurred on clear days with dry roads and perfect visibility. Cars were found crushed along the shoulder with no evidence of another vehicle involved, no tire marks indicating a sudden swerve, and no logical explanation for the trauma inflicted upon the twisted metal. In May of 2003, state officials finally bowed to public pressure and indigenous leaders who argued the number was a cursed relic. The highway signs were replaced, Route 666 became Route 491. The politicians and highway patrol supervisors hoped that scrubbing the mark of the beast from the map would purge the highway of its dark legacy. They believed new metal signs would bring safety. But the land does not care about human administration. The geography remained unchanged, and the road continued to collect its toll in the dead of night. The local folklore of the Navajo has always warned against lingering in this territory after dark. There are hushed stories of skinwalkers, dark entities capable of taking animal form, keeping pace with vehicles traveling at 70 miles per hour. There are accounts of pale, featureless faces pressing against passenger windows in the middle of a desolate run. But among those who drive heavy freight for a living, there is a different, more mechanical terror. It is the legend of the phantom rigs, massive black trucks that hunt on the endless straightaways, leaving no trace but the wreckage of those they force off the road. To understand the dread, one must understand the environment. Picture a lone commercial driver hauling a heavy payload through the vast emptiness near the border of Utah and Colorado. The time is exactly 3 a.m. This is the hour when the human body begs for sleep, when the mind begins to play tricks, and when the veil between reality and nightmares wears dangerously thin. The driver sits high in the cab of an 18-wheeler, surrounded by the monotonous hum of diesel power and the relentless drone of heavy tires on cold asphalt. Beyond the reach of the headlights, the world ceases to exist. There are no streetlights, there are no distant farmhouses glowing in the dark. There is only the yellow center line flashing past, a hypnotic metronome marking the passage of time through a void. The cabin temperature is warm, yet a deep chill seems to radiate from the glass of the windshield. The driver reaches for the radio dial, seeking the comfort of a late-night broadcast or the chatter of another trucker on the Citizens Band. The radio offers nothing. The steady signal of a distant country music station abruptly warps, the music bending out of tune before dissolving entirely. It is replaced by a thick, heavy hiss of static. The driver turns the dial, scanning through the frequencies. Every channel yields the same dense, aggressive white noise. Even the emergency channel is dead. The electronic isolation mirrors the physical isolation. The truck is a lone island of steel moving through a sea of black sand and stone. It is then that the driver checks the side mirror. Far in the distance, swallowed by the immense dark of the highway, twin points of light appear. They are headlights, burning with an intense, unnatural halogen glare. At first, they are a minor detail, just another traveler sharing the lonely road. But within a matter of seconds, the lights grow significantly larger. The distance is closing at a rate that defies the physics of a heavy vehicle. The driver checks the speedometer. The 18-wheeler is pushing 75 miles per hour. Yet, the lights in the mirror are approaching as if the driver's rig is parked on the shoulder. The driver grips the steering wheel tighter, expecting the violent rush of wind and the deafening roar of a modified engine as the reckless vehicle overtakes. A massive rig moving at that speed displaces a massive amount of air. It commands a physical presence, but as the blinding headlights fill the entirety of the side mirrors, turning the interior of the cab a stark, clinical white, there is no sound. The silence is the first true indicator of the nightmare. The driver's own diesel engine continues to hum, but from the approaching vehicle there is absolute quiet, no grinding of heavy gears. No roar of a supercharged engine, no heavy tires screaming against the asphalt. The massive shape pulls out from behind, gliding into the opposing lane to pass. The driver glances out the driver's side window, preparing to curse the reckless operator. Instead, the words die in the throat. The vehicle pulling alongside is another tractor-trailer, but it is deeply wrong. It is a colossal machine painted in a matte black so absolute that it seems to absorb the faint ambient light of the moon. There is no chrome trim, there are no reflective safety strips, there is no company logo painted on the side of the trailer. It is a silhouette of pure, heavy darkness given physical form, moving silently at an impossible speed. The phantom truck aligns itself perfectly with the driver's rig. They are moving parallel, hurtling through the desert night side by side. The driver looks across the narrow gap between the two massive machines, peering up into the cab of the black truck. The interior of the phantom rig is not lit by dashboard dials or a soft overhead light. It is pitch black. Yet, the driver's eyes adjust just enough to perceive the horrifying truth. The heavy leather seat is empty. There is no one behind the wheel. The massive steering column remains perfectly still, yet the truck maintains a flawless trajectory. There is no driver, no human element controlling this tons of hurtling steel. It is an empty vessel, operating with a malicious, independent will. Before the driver can fully process the impossible sight, the black truck begins to drift. It does not swerve violently, it moves with a slow, deliberate, and crushing intent. The phantom rig crosses the yellow center line, invading the driver's lane. The sheer mass of the black truck forces the driver to adjust the steering wheel, edging the 18-wheeler toward the right. The right side tires hit the rumble strip. The sudden, violent vibration shakes the cab, a desperate mechanical warning. The asphalt here is narrow. Beyond the thin shoulder lies a steep, crumbling embankment leading down into the dark, jagged ravines that line this section of Route 491. The phantom truck continues its silent push. It does not scrape against the driver's vehicle. There is no spark of colliding metal, only an oppressive, magnetic pressure forcing the living driver further out of the lane. The driver slams on the air brakes. The massive tires lock, screaming in protest as the heavy rig fights to shed speed. Plumes of acrid blue smoke erupt from the wheel wells. The truck bucks and shudders, the trailer threatening to jackknife as the rear wheels slide perilously close to the edge of the abyss. The world becomes a chaotic blur of vibration, the smell of burning rubber, and the terrifying pull of gravity toward the unseen canyon floor. As the driver's rig finally grinds to a violent halt, the front right tire resting mere inches from a fatal drop, the driver looks up. The black truck has not slowed down. It has not merged back into the lane, it simply continues its forward trajectory, the blinding red glow of its taillights fading into the distance. Then, in the blink of an eye, the red lights extinguish. The massive black shape dissolves into the desert night. There is no sound of an engine fading into the distance. There is no dust trail. The phantom vehicle simply ceases to be, leaving behind nothing but the cold, vast emptiness of the highway. The driver sits trembling in the frozen cab, hands fused to the steering wheel, chest heaving with shallow breaths. The radio crackles to life, the static abruptly replaced by the clear, sharp twang of a guitar from a distant station. The natural world has returned. But as the driver looks down past the hood of the truck into the yawning blackness of the ravine, a sickening realization takes hold. Down in the depths of those canyons, hidden by the shadows and the jagged rocks, lie the rusted, twisted frames of vehicles that never made it home. They belong to the drivers who did not wake up in time, the ones who did not hit the brakes fast enough when the empty black rigs silently pushed them over the edge. Route 491 may have a new sign, but the pavement remains stained with the past, and the isolated night still belongs to the things that hunt on the Devil's Highway. An Ontario forest camera captured something after midnight. The sequence of photographs began at 2:14 in the morning. David sat alone at his small kitchen table, the pale glow of the laptop screen casting long, distorted shadows across the empty room as he slowly clicked through the silent captures from trail camera number 4. The first 3 images showed nothing but the dark, freezing timber of the provincial wilderness, illuminated only by the harsh, flat burst of the infrared flash. But the 4th image, time-stamped 2:17 a.m., contained a pale, smeared blur at the extreme edge of the tree line. It was tall, far too tall to be a wolf or a roaming black bear, and its shape did not make geometric sense in the context of the dense, tangled brush. David was a field biologist studying seasonal migration patterns deep in the sprawling, unbroken forests of northern Ontario. It was a profoundly lonely profession, one that required long, uninterrupted stretches of isolation in a rudimentary cabin located 50 miles from the nearest paved road. The surrounding landscape was a vast, unforgiving ocean of black spruce, cedar, and birch, a place where the deep winter cold could snap a dry branch with the echoing sound of a rifle shot. To monitor the wildlife without disturbing them, David relied on a wide network of 30 motion-activated trail cameras, heavily strapped to tree trunks along natural game trails and frozen creeks. Camera number 4 was his most remote station. It was located 3 miles deep into a heavily wooded valley that the older locals and indigenous guides simply called the Black Ridge. It was a notoriously quiet patch of timber. According to regional historical records, a commercial logging company had attempted to clear the ridge in 1922, but they completely abandoned the camp after only 2 months. The official reports cited logistical failures and severe, unpredictable weather, but rumors persisted for decades that the lumberjacks simply refused to work in the deep shadows of those particular trees. They claimed the woods were unnatural, entirely devoid of animal sounds, and that their heavy equipment was constantly being dragged or moved in the middle of the night. David had never paid much attention to local folklore. He was a man of strict science, relying entirely on data, timestamps, and observable facts. When he had hiked out to retrieve the memory card from the Black Ridge earlier that afternoon, the heavy plastic casing of the camera had been covered in a thick, undisturbed layer of frost. It had sat in the silent woods, untouched by human hands, for 4 long weeks. Now, sitting alone in his locked cabin, with the diesel generator humming softly outside and the freezing wind picking up off the surface of the frozen lake, the digital data he was observing was beginning to defy all scientific logic. He clicked to the next photograph. The timestamp read 2:18 a.m. The pale blur had moved closer to the center of the frame. It was entirely motionless in the frozen capture, yet it was distinctly closer to the lens. The camera's infrared sensor rendered everything in stark, ghostly shades of gray, black, and white, and whatever this entity was, it reflected the invisible flash with an unnatural, sickening intensity. It looked like a towering figure wrapped in something damp and ragged, or perhaps something that had no clear defining physical edges. Its limbs, if they could accurately be called limbs, seemed terribly long, bending at subtle, wrong angles that defied the natural mechanics of bone and joint. David zoomed in on the image, leaning closer to the monitor, watching the pixels dissolve into grainy white noise. A cold, prickling sensation crept slowly up the back of his neck. He glanced up from the screen, his eyes darting toward the cabin window. Beyond the thick glass, the night was absolute, suffocating black. He suddenly felt acutely aware of exactly how far he was from any other living human being. If he were to scream, the sound would simply be swallowed by the millions of silent trees surrounding him. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, forced his eyes back to the glowing screen, and pressed the right arrow key. According to the digital data embedded in the image files, the motion sensor was being triggered precisely every 60 seconds. A passing deer, a lynx, or even a wandering moose would have walked through the narrow frame and vanished into the brush within moments. But this presence was intentionally lingering. It was deliberately staying within the camera's narrow field of view. He clicked forward. 2:19 a.m., 2:20 a.m., 2:21 a.m. In each successive photograph, the pale figure shifted slightly, inching agonizingly closer to the hidden lens. The movement was entirely linear, a slow, methodical approach entirely devoid of the erratic, nervous caution of a wild animal. By 2:24 a.m., the pale mass occupied the entire left half of the image. The face, if it possessed a face, was completely obscured by a smooth, featureless stretch of pale, tightly stretched gray. There were no reflective eyes catching the infrared light, no snout, no visible ears. Yet, the overall posture of the towering thing suggested a terrifyingly intense focus. It was looking directly down into the lens. It was observing the small, blinking red light of the motion sensor just as intently as the camera was observing it. The wind outside his cabin began to howl through the eaves, rattling the loose pane of glass in the living room window with a rapid, violent shaking. David paused his clicking, his finger hovering over the keyboard. He listened to the bitter draft whistling through the log walls, a sound he had heard 1,000 times before, but tonight it sounded hollow, almost mournful in the dark. The cast-iron wood stove in the corner of the room popped loudly, making his shoulders jump. He rubbed his tired eyes, trying desperately to rationalize what he was looking at. He told himself it was a technical artifact of the flash, a trick of falling snow and deep shadows, a piece of birch bark caught in a spiderweb directly in front of the lens. He looked back at the screen. The timestamp on the next file was 2:30 a.m. A gap of exactly 6 minutes had passed where the camera had captured absolutely nothing. He hesitated for a long moment before pressing the key. The image captured at 2:30 a.m. was almost entirely blinding white. At first, David thought the camera had finally malfunctioned, completely blinded by a sudden flurry of heavy snow reflecting the intense flash. But as his eyes slowly adjusted to the harsh contrast, his breath caught sharply in his throat. He realized the white mass filling the screen was the actual surface of the thing itself. It was standing mere inches from the camera lens. The physical texture of it was entirely wrong. It did not look like rough fabric, nor did it look like thick animal fur. It looked like stretched, damp parchment, pulled agonizingly tight over an unseen, shifting frame. Near the upper right corner of the frame, there was a dark, cavernous void, a jagged, asymmetrical tear in the pale mass that faintly resembled a hollow, silently screaming mouth. And behind that terrible void, the dark outline of the familiar pine trees was completely blocked out. The entity was massive. It was entirely suffocating the camera. David pushed his wooden chair heavily back from the table. The scraping sound across the floorboards echoed far too loudly in the silent, empty cabin. He stood up, pacing the small confines of the kitchen, his heart hammering rhythmically against his ribs. He tried to build a logical, scientific explanation. Perhaps a large white owl had swooped down and temporarily covered the lens with its massive wing. Perhaps a wandering moose had pressed its wet nose directly against the plastic casing. He repeated these logical scenarios in his mind, trying to anchor himself firmly to reality, but the logic felt incredibly fragile. An owl would not have taken 16 minutes to slowly approach the camera from the distant tree line. A moose would have triggered the sensitive motion sensor with its massive bulk long before it ever reached the lens. He forced himself to sit back down in the wooden chair. There were still 22 unread photos left in the designated computer folder. He took a slow, shaky breath and pressed the arrow key. 2:31 a.m. The lens was perfectly clear again. The pale, suffocating figure was entirely gone. The forest looked perfectly normal. An empty, mundane corridor of dark evergreens standing silent in the freezing night. David let out a long, heavy breath, feeling a sudden, rushing wave of profound relief wash over him. It was gone. Whatever the anomaly was, it had finally moved on. He clicked to the next image, expecting to see nothing but empty, static woods until dawn. The timestamp read 2:32 a.m. The woods were indeed still empty, but there was a single, terrifying detail in the lower right corner of the frame that immediately caught his attention. It was a fresh footprint pressed deep into the light dusting of snow on the forest floor. In the previous clear image, the snow had been completely undisturbed. Now there was a deep, elongated impression. It was far too long and wide to be a human boot, and it possessed no distinct toes, claws, or animal pads. It was simply a heavy, crushing, dragging mark that smeared roughly through the frost, deeply exposing the dark earth beneath. He clicked rapidly through the next 15 photos. 2:35 a.m., 2:40 a.m., 2:45 a.m., 2:52 a.m. The woods remained entirely empty. The single footprint remained perfectly untouched by wind or fresh snow. Yet, the camera continued to trigger. It fired its silent flash into the absolute void of the forest over and over again, capturing nothing but static trees and that single, strange track. This slow realization chilled David to his absolute core. If the camera was entirely motion-activated, something heavy and substantial was still moving out there in the dark. It was either moving far too fast for the digital shutter to capture, or it was moving just outside the narrow cone of the camera's vision, pacing endlessly back and forth in the blind spots. As David reached the very end of the digital folder, he noticed a deeply unsettling pattern in the timestamps of the final 5 photographs. They were no longer being triggered minutes apart. They were triggering mere seconds apart, as if the sensor was being completely overwhelmed by frantic, rapid motion. 3 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock and 12 seconds, 3 o'clock and 25 seconds. He cycled through them, the images flashing rapidly on his screen like a crude, disjointed stop-motion film. In the first 3 images, the forest was perfectly still and empty. But in the 4th image, captured at exactly 3 o'clock and 38 seconds, the entire perspective of the camera had violently shifted. The lens was no longer pointing straight down the frozen game trail, it was pointing directly upward into the dense, tangled canopy of the dark trees. The heavy canvas strap used to secure the camera to the trunk, a thick woven band rated for hundreds of pounds of pressure, had been snapped with incredible, sudden force. The final photograph in the folder, taken at 3 o'clock and 40 seconds, was captured while the camera was in a chaotic state of freefall. It was a blurry, deeply disorienting smear of dark branches, falling snow, and pitch-black sky. But in the very center of that chaotic blur, illuminated briefly by the dying burst of the flash, was an incredibly long, pale, multi-jointed appendage reaching straight down from the high branches above. It bent back upon itself in a sickening, impossible geometry, its surface perfectly matching the damp parchment texture of the pale mass from earlier. It was reaching down through the air, grasping blindly toward the falling camera. David did not sleep a single minute that night. He sat frozen at his kitchen table until the dull, gray light of a winter dawn finally crept slowly through the frosted windows, his tired eyes fixed, unblinking, on that final, blurry image. When the winter sun was fully above the tree line, he packed a heavy rifle, loaded his truck, and drove the 3 miles down the rutted, icy logging road. He parked at the dead end and hiked the final mile into the Black Ridge section on foot, determined to retrieve his broken equipment and prove to himself that this was all an elaborate prank by local hunters or a bizarre mechanical failure. When he finally located the specific pine tree where camera number 4 had been mounted, the torn remnants of the canvas strap were still dangling loosely from the rough bark, its thick edges violently frayed and torn. The heavy, reinforced plastic casing of the camera lay shattered into a dozen jagged pieces on the frozen, unforgiving ground. The small alkaline batteries were scattered in the white snow, completely drained of all their power. He gathered the broken pieces of plastic in complete silence, his gloved hand gripping the leather strap of his rifle tightly, his eyes constantly scanning the dense, overarching canopy of heavy pine branches above his head. The woods around him were utterly, unnaturally silent. There were no winter birds calling in the distance, no wind whistling through the dry needles, no sound of small animals scurrying through the dead underbrush. It felt like standing completely still inside a vacuum. As he finally turned to leave the ridge, eager to get back to the safety and warmth of his truck, he looked down at the wide base of the massive pine tree. The morning sun had melted some of the lighter frost, but in the damp, exposed earth around the thick roots, he found a continuous, unbroken series of those deep, dragged impressions. They did not lead away into the deeper forest, nor did they lead back toward the established game trail. The massive, dragging tracks circled the base of the tree, over and over again, trampling the loose soil into a dark, muddy, chaotic ring before simply stopping directly beneath the thickest, highest branches. According to provincial employment records, David never returned to the Black Ridge area, nor did he ever finish his research contract. He submitted his seasonal ecological report a full month early, packed up his remote cabin in a single afternoon, and relocated to a completely different wildlife reserve over 400 miles away. The memory card containing the late-night infrared images was reportedly locked away in a private safety deposit box, never published in any of his official surveys, and never shown to his academic colleagues. To this day, local hunters and brave hikers who venture too far into the deep, silent timber of northern Ontario sometimes report finding strange, deep tracks circling the base of the oldest trees. And in the small, isolated logging towns bordering the vast wilderness, a quiet, persistent rumor still survives among those who spend their lives in the woods. They say that if you leave a camera out in the deep timber overnight, you should never review the footage taken between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. Because whatever slowly wanders the Black Ridge at that hour is learning exactly how the blinking cameras work, and it does not like being watched. An Alaska bush pilot reported something following his aircraft. The unnatural drop in cabin temperature happens first, followed almost immediately by the compass needle drifting lazily away from true north. The pilot, a man named Arthur, is entirely alone above the vast, empty expanse of the Yukon-Koyukuk region. It is 11:40 p.m. on a moonless Tuesday in late November. The glass of the windshield is coated in a creeping layer of frost, but what catches his attention is not the ice, it is the solid black shape moving steadily just off his right wing. It is darker than the night sky, a massive void blocking out the distant, cold stars. Arthur has flown these northern routes for 14 years. He knows the unforgiving airspace like the back of his hand. He is flying a standard, unglamorous cargo run, carrying mail, heavy machinery parts, and medical supplies from a small, isolated outpost back toward the airfield in Fairbanks. The flight is normally a quiet, meditative stretch of time, marked only by the steady, rhythmic drone of the single engine and the faint red glow of the instrument panel illuminating his tired face. Below him, the landscape is a frozen, jagged wasteland, heavily forested and entirely devoid of human life. There are no roads down there, no cabins, no emergency landing strips. There is just an endless ocean of deep snow and ancient pine where the temperature sits at 40 degrees below zero. He reaches forward to adjust the frequency on his aviation radio. He depresses the button on the worn control yoke to hail the regional flight service station, intending to ask if there is any other logged traffic in his sector. When he speaks into the headset, the only response is a thick, wet static. It does not sound like typical atmospheric interference or a lost signal. It sounds heavy and deliberate, almost rhythmic, like the slow, mechanical breathing of something massive resting at the bottom of a deep well. He tries a different frequency, twisting the dial to the universal emergency channel. The bizarre static follows him. It is perfectly uniform across every band. The shape on his right begins to shift. It does not bank or turn the way a conventional aircraft should. It simply slides laterally through the air, maintaining a perfect, unnatural parallel to his wing. Arthur reduces his speed, pulling the throttle back slightly to let the strange object pass him by. The needle on his airspeed indicator drops to 100 knots. The massive shadow slows with him. It matches his deceleration instantly without any visible thrust, exhaust, or momentum correction. The engine of his small plane struggles against the freezing thin air, but from the void outside, there is absolute, terrifying silence. A cold sweat breaks out on the back of his neck, chilling him despite his heavy winter gear. According to aviation reports and local legends, pilots in the far north occasionally see strange things over the ice. They see ice crystals reflecting moonlight, classified military test flights out of distant bases, or the aurora borealis playing tricks on tired eyes. But there is no moonlight tonight, and no military aircraft flies without strobe lights while hugging the side of a civilian plane in the dead of winter. Arthur pushes the yoke forward, descending 500 feet in a sudden, evasive maneuver. His stomach drops with the sudden loss of altitude. He levels out at 5,500 feet. He looks out the frost-covered right window. The black mass is still there, filling the space exactly as it had before, perfectly matching his dive. The temperature inside the tiny cockpit continues to plummet rapidly. The small cabin heater, which had been working perfectly for the first 2 hours of the flight, now blows freezing air that bites at his exposed cheeks. Ice begins to creep rapidly across the inside of the windows, forming complex, jagged patterns that distort his view of the outside world. He reaches out with a thick, gloved hand to wipe the frost away from the side window. As his hand nears the glass, the hairs on his arm stand straight up. A heavy, crackling, static charge fills the small cabin, making the air taste like copper and ozone. The analog dials on his instrument panel begin to twitch violently. The altimeter spins out of control, registering an impossible climb to 10,000 feet, then a sudden dive to zero, over and over again. Up until now, the object has been nothing more than a silhouette, a hole in the sky. But as the dark shape drifts slightly forward, pacing the nose of his plane, Arthur notices a faint, unnatural illumination along its lower edge. It is a dull, sickly yellow glow, the color of old, rotting parchment. The light does not cast beams into the dark sky. It seems to be absorbed by the dark metal or whatever unknown material the craft is made of. The glow pulses slowly, swelling and fading to the exact rhythm of the heavy, wet static still broadcasting in his headset. With each pulse of the yellow light, the engine of his small plane coughs, the revolutions per minute dropping dangerously low before recovering. Panic begins to take root in his chest, cold and sharp. If the engine dies over this remote stretch of mountains in the middle of winter, there is absolutely no chance of survival. There is nowhere to glide, nowhere to land, and even if he somehow manages to bring the plane down into a snowbank without tearing it apart, the sub-zero temperatures will freeze him solid before morning. He frantically taps the fuel gauge with his knuckle, making sure the line is not freezing solid. The tank is half full. He adjusts the fuel mixture, trying desperately to keep the struggling engine running smooth. But the mechanical components of his plane feel entirely secondary now. The object outside is dictating the reality of the airspace. The yellow light pulses again, much brighter this time. The engine sputters hard, a violent metallic shudder vibrating through the entire airframe. The massive object suddenly banks directly toward him. The sheer scale of it becomes terrifyingly clear in the darkness. It is not the size of another small cargo plane. It is the size of a large commercial airliner, perhaps even larger, but it has no wings. It is shaped like a massive, blunt cylinder, perfectly smooth and devoid of windows. It closes the distance between them in a fraction of a second, violating all known laws of inertia and aerodynamics. It is so close now that it blocks out the entire right hemisphere of the sky, its hull looming just feet from his wingtip. The dull yellow light shifts violently. It turns into a blinding, pale green luminescence that completely floods the cockpit. The pale light washes out the comforting red glow of his instruments. It casts long, unnatural, stretching shadows across the cabin. In that blinding green glare, the loud, steady sound of his own engine disappears completely. The silence that follows is absolute and crushing. For several agonizing seconds, Arthur is suspended in a soundless void, falling through the night sky in a dead metal tube bathed in sickly green light. He grabs the controls, pulling back with all his strength. The yoke goes completely stiff. It will not budge a single inch. The rudder pedals are locked firmly in place. He is no longer flying the aircraft. He is a helpless passenger in his own plane, trapped in a silent, invisible grip of unknown origin, plummeting quietly toward the jagged mountain peaks hidden in the dark below. He waits for the inevitable impact. He watches the broken altimeter dial, which is now completely frozen at 4,000 feet. The green light outside the window is so intense he can see the dark blue veins in the back of his own hands, sharp and clear against his pale skin. Then, as abruptly and inexplicably as it began, the green light extinguishes. The heavy, crushing pressure in the cabin vanishes in an instant. The control yoke jerks violently forward in his hands, nearly breaking his wrists. The deafening mechanical roar of the single engine returns, painfully loud after the profound, unnatural silence. The plane drops sharply, catching a turbulent updraft. Arthur fights the controls, desperately pulling the nose up just as the dark, jagged silhouette of a snow-covered mountain ridge scrapes past the underbelly of the aircraft. He clears the deadly peak by less than 200 feet. The plane rattles and shakes in the disturbed air, but the propeller is spinning. It is flying. He gasps for air, his lungs burning deeply as if he has been holding his breath underwater for minutes. He looks frantically out the right window. The sky is entirely empty. The distant stars have returned, cold and indifferent, scattered across the endless black canvas of the northern night. The heavy, breathing static in his headset is gone, replaced entirely by the normal, quiet hiss of an empty radio frequency. He does not reach out to touch the radio again. He flies the remaining 80 miles to the airfield in complete, paranoid silence, keeping his eyes fixed straight ahead through the frosted glass. Every dark cloud on the horizon looks like a massive, silent cylinder waiting to drop out of the sky and swallow him. He lands the plane at the empty airfield just after 1:30 a.m. The yellow runway lights seem unnaturally bright, burning his tired eyes. When he taxis the aircraft to his designated hangar and finally cuts the engine, he does not immediately unbuckle his harness. He sits alone in the freezing dark cockpit, his hands shaking violently on his lap, staring blankly at the frost slowly melting on the glass. When the sleepy ground crew finally approaches with flashlights to ask why he is just sitting there in the dark, Arthur unbuckles his belt and steps out onto the icy tarmac. His legs are weak, barely able to support his weight. He tells the mechanics to check the electrical system, claiming he suffered a temporary alternator failure over the mountains. He does not mention the massive shadow. He does not mention the dead silence or the blinding green light. The official maintenance report, filed by the crew 3 days later, notes absolutely no mechanical faults with the engine, the battery, or the alternator. The plane is thoroughly inspected and deemed perfectly safe for regular flight. However, the lead mechanic mentions a highly unusual anomaly in his handwritten notes at the bottom of the page. Along the entire right side of the aluminum fuselage, the standard white paint is heavily discolored. It is a pale, sickly yellow, as if the metal had been subjected to intense, localized heat or strange radiation. The scorch mark is massive, extending unbroken from the nose of the plane all the way to the tail, yet the metal itself is not warped or melted in any way. Arthur never flies that northern route again. He quietly requests a transfer to daytime cargo runs in the southern, more populated part of the state, avoiding the remote mountain passes entirely. Other veteran pilots occasionally ask him about the strange, yellow discoloration on the side of his old plane, which remains parked at the far edge of the frozen airfield. They ask if he flew through a strange chemical cloud or if weird atmospheric lightning struck the wing during a storm. He always gives a vague, dismissive answer and quickly changes the subject. But on cold, moonless winter nights, when the aviation radio in the dispatch office picks up a heavy, rhythmic static, the older pilots at the airfield fall perfectly silent. They step outside and look out toward the dark northern horizon, wondering what is drifting quietly through the freezing blackness, pacing the empty skies, waiting for the sound of a lonely engine. The silence of the Villisca house. The town of Villisca, Iowa, in the early summer of 1912 was a place defined by its predictability. It was a thriving agricultural hub, a tight-knit community where front doors were rarely locked, and the rhythm of life was dictated by the sun and the ringing of the church bell. On the surface, the evening of June 9th was no different from any other. The air was thick with the humid weight of a Midwestern summer, the kind of heat that lingers long after the sun has set, drawing insects to the warm glow of porch lamps. On East 2nd Street, a white, two-story frame house sat quietly in the gathering dusk. It was the home of Josiah Moore, a successful local businessman, his wife Sarah, and their 4 young children. But on this particular Sunday, the house was not entirely empty. Even though the family was away, someone was already inside. The Moore family had spent the evening at the local Presbyterian church attending the annual Children's Day exercises. Sarah Moore had co-directed the program, and all of her children, 11-year-old Herman, 10-year-old Catherine, 7-year-old Boyd, and 5-year-old Paul had participated. They were accompanied by 2 neighborhood friends, 12-year-old Lena Stillinger and her 8-year-old sister Ina, who had been invited to spend the night. It was a joyous, exhausting evening of recitations and hymns. While the children sang in the crowded, brightly lit sanctuary, their home stood in deep shadow, silently harboring a trespasser. Police investigations would later reveal the chilling truth of those empty hours. Sometime during the late afternoon or early evening, while the house was unoccupied, a figure walked through the unlocked front door. They did not ransack the drawers or search for silver. They simply found a place to hide. They climbed the narrow stairs, maneuvering into the cramped, unfinished attic space located in the upper reaches of the house. The true horror of the Villisca tragedy does not merely lie in the bloodshed that followed, but in the agonizing, suffocating hours of anticipation. To understand the terror is to picture that dark, unventilated attic on a hot June night. The temperature under the sloping roof would have been stifling, the stagnant air thick with dust, and the smell of dry timber. Yet, the intruder remained completely still. They sat on the rough wooden joists, enveloped in absolute darkness, gripping a heavy axe. It was Josiah Moore's own axe, likely retrieved from the backyard before the killer slipped inside. 2 cigarette butts were later found near a slight depression in the floorboards, a quiet testament to the killer's unnerving patience. He sat there, smoking in the dark, listening and waiting. Around 9:30 p.m., the sound of footsteps on the front porch shattered the silence. The heavy wooden door swung open, letting in the warm night air and the overlapping voices of 6 tired, happy children. From the pitch blackness of the attic, the intruder could hear everything. The muffled thud of Sunday shoes being kicked off, the clinking of glass and porcelain as Sarah Moore served the children milk and a plate of cookies, the low, comforting murmur of Josiah's voice as he spoke to his wife. The floorboards of the Moore house were thin. To the man crouching in the attic, the family was painfully close. He could track their movements by the creaking wood beneath his feet. He listened as the children washed their faces, their laughter drifting up through the plaster ceiling. He listened as Josiah and Sarah moved about the parlor, performing the mundane, intimate rituals of closing up the house for the night. They felt entirely safe. They were completely unaware that death was suspended just inches above their heads, holding its breath. Slowly, the noises began to change. The energetic chatter faded into sleepy whispers. The 2 Stillinger girls, Lena and Ina, settled into the guest bed in the downstairs parlor. Josiah and Sarah climbed the stairs to their bedroom on the 2nd floor. The 4 more children went to their respective beds down the hall. The warm glow of the oil lamps was extinguished one by one, plunging the house into deep, heavy darkness. Now began the most agonizing phase of the killer's vigil. He did not strike immediately. He understood the delicate rhythm of human sleep. He knew that the initial descent into slumber is fragile, easily broken by a sudden creak or a shifting shadow, and so he waited in the suffocating heat of his hiding place. He waited for the house to cool down. He waited for the quiet rustling of cotton sheets to cease. He waited with a predator's discipline until the collective breathing of 8 people slowed, deepened, and fell into the steady, rhythmic cadence of profound, vulnerable sleep. Midnight passed. The town of Villisca was dead to the world. Inside the house on East 2nd Street, the silence was absolute, save for the soft sound of air filling sleeping lungs. In the attic, the unseen watcher finally moved. He gathered his weapon, he shifted his weight off the wooden joists, his muscles undoubtedly stiff from hours of motionless waiting. Slowly, meticulously, he descended the narrow attic stairs. The darkness of the house was absolute, but he moved with a chilling sense of purpose. He did not immediately go to the bedrooms. Instead, he engaged in a bizarre, methodical preparation that would baffle investigators for decades. He found pieces of clothing and linens in the dark. He draped them over the mirrors in the house. He hung cloth over the glass panels of the doors. He systematically covered every reflective surface, ensuring that neither he nor his victims would have to look upon the work he was about to do. He carried a heavy slab of iron and wood. The axe blade was sharp, but he turned it around in his hands, opting for the blunt, crushing flat of the axe head. He moved toward the master bedroom first. Josiah and Sarah Moore were deeply asleep. The killer approached Josiah's side of the bed. He raised the axe high above his head in the pitch-black room, the heavy iron catching whatever faint starlight bled through the drawn curtains. He brought it down with devastating force. He struck Josiah, then Sarah, moving with a fluid, mechanical rhythm that offered no chance for screams. The parents died in their beds, swallowed by the dark before they could even open their eyes to the nightmare. Leaving the master bedroom, the shadow moved down the hall. Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul lay in their beds, their small chests rising and falling under their blankets. The killer moved from bed to bed. The heavy, wet thud of iron on bone was the only sound in the house. There was no struggle, there was no waking, just the relentless, sweeping arc of the axe in the suffocating blackness. 6 lives had been extinguished on the 2nd floor, but the intruder was not finished. He gripped the bloodied handle of the axe and descended the main staircase to the 1st floor. In the parlor, 12-year-old Lena and 8-year-old Ina Stillinger were asleep in the guest bed. Perhaps a loose floorboard creaked. Perhaps the heavy, sudden scent of copper in the air disturbed her. Investigators later found chilling evidence that Lena, the oldest of the children, might have briefly awakened in the dark. She was found lying crosswise on the bed, a defensive posture, a desperate and futile attempt to shield herself from the descending shadow. It was over in moments. With 8 bodies lying motionless in the dark, the killer's grim ritual continued. He moved through the silent rooms, taking pieces of clothing from the dressers. He carefully draped the garments over the ruined faces of his victims, hiding them from the world. He took a 2-pound slab of uncut bacon from the icebox in the kitchen and placed it on the floor in the guest bedroom alongside a piece of a keychain. He drew the window shades tight. He filled a bowl with water, washed his hands at the kitchen table, and left the bloody water behind. Finally, he locked the front door from the inside, took Josiah's keys, stepped out into the cool pre-dawn air, and vanished into the night. The morning of June 10th broke bright and clear. By 7 o'clock, the neighborhood was beginning to stir. Mary Peckham, an elderly woman who lived next door to the Moores, stepped out onto her porch to hang laundry. She noticed a strange, heavy stillness about the house next door. There were no children playing in the yard. The chickens had not been fed. The morning chores were entirely abandoned. The house was locked tight, the shades drawn all the way down to the sills. By 8 o'clock, her mild concern had turned to a gnawing dread. Mary called Josiah's brother, Ross Moore. Ross arrived shortly after with a spare key. He unlocked the front door and stepped into the dim, quiet parlor. The air inside was thick, smelling heavily of copper and voided bowels. He called out into the gloom. There was no answer. He pushed open the door to the downstairs guest room and saw the dark, rust-colored stains soaking through the bedsheets and the unnatural stillness of the two little girls. Ross Moore stumbled out of the house, his face ashen, and told Mary to call the marshal. Within hours, the entire town of Villisca would know that the unimaginable had happened. The house was descended upon by law enforcement, doctors, and a horrified, panic-stricken public. They found the covered mirrors, they found the basin of bloody water, they found the 8 bodies, completely unrecognizable, their faces shattered and hidden beneath bloody clothes. And when they finally climbed into the suffocating heat of the attic, they found the 2 cigarette butts. They found the slight depression in the dust where a man had sat for hours. The voice that only spoke after midnight in New Mexico. The first recording began with a chair scraping across a kitchen floor, then a long stretch of nothing at all, and then a woman in the house turning toward an empty doorway because someone had answered a question she had never asked out loud. The tape caught only a few sounds before the voice came. A breath, the soft rattle of dishes in a sink, wind at the windows. Then, from somewhere beyond the small dark hall, a low reply in a man's voice, patient and near, as if he had been standing there listening for some time. When the woman later described that moment, she said the worst part was not what the voice sounded like, it was that it had answered the exact thought she had held in silence, with her lips closed and her hands still under cold running water. The house stood alone in the north of New Mexico, far from town, with a dirt road that narrowed into stone and brush before reaching the property. It was an old place, adobe and timber, low to the ground, with deep-set windows and a roof darkened by years of wind and sun. The nearest neighbors were scattered too widely to hear a cry in the night, and at certain hours, the silence there seemed to gather shape, settling against the walls like another layer of plaster. People in the region had long kept stories about voices traveling strangely over open land. Some spoke of old songs heard where no one stood. Others mentioned names whispered from arroyos after dark. Most of those stories lived where such stories often live, half in memory and half in habit, repeated on porches, lowered near children, then laughed away by morning. The people in the house were not looking for any of that. According to later accounts, they were practical enough to begin with ordinary explanations. A radio left on somewhere, a rancher passing in the dark, sound carrying from the road, one of them talking in their sleep. Yet the first incidents carried a small detail that kept returning. The voice did not interrupt. It replied. It came only after midnight and only after someone in the house had formed a question privately, inwardly, with no sound behind it. The answer would not always come at once. Sometimes there would be a delay long enough for the person to convince themselves they had imagined the whole uneasy chain of thought. Then, from another room or the far end of the hallway, the reply would arrive in a tone so natural it seemed almost intimate. Not loud, not theatrical, merely present. At first, the answers were simple. Where did she put the keys? In the blue bowl. Why was the dog staring at the back door? Because he hears me. Who forgot to latch the pantry? Not him. Those close to the case would later disagree on the wording of the recordings, and some tapes were said to be too faint to judge with confidence. But a pattern appears in every retelling. The voice knew what had not been spoken. It responded in the rhythm of conversation, as if another unseen resident had been waiting for a pause. By the time the family began placing cassette recorders around the house, they were no longer trying to prove the strange events to outsiders. They were trying to determine whether they themselves were still perceiving the world correctly. The tapes, according to those who claimed to have heard them, were inconsistent in the way such evidence often is. Most of them contained long lengths of ordinary room noise, a stove ticking as it cooled, a dog shifting in sleep, screen doors moving slightly in the wind. Now and then there was a segment that raised the hair on the neck. In one, a child could be heard waking and beginning to cry in a bedroom at the end of the hall. Before any adult entered, before a single soothing word was spoken, a voice inside the room murmured, calm and level, almost too low for the recorder to catch. The crying stopped immediately. When the mother reached the bed, the child was upright beneath the blanket, staring toward the ceiling corner and smiling at something in the dark. The family stopped letting the children sleep alone after that. Reports of investigators visiting the property began much later, after a relative played one of the tapes for a local radio host with an interest in regional folklore. That was enough to turn a private fear into a public rumor. Men with microphones came out from Albuquerque. A pair of researchers from farther west, who had built reputations collecting haunted house audio, drove in with cases of equipment and too much confidence. One retired sheriff visited because he had known the family by name and did not like how shaken they sounded on the phone. No one fully agreed on what was found there, which in some ways only strengthened the story. The radio men thought the house produced unusual echoes because of its shape and thick walls. One of the researchers suspected ventriloquism, fraud, or a member of the household acting out a pattern that had grown into obsession. The retired sheriff did not offer theories. He stayed one night, left before dawn, and later told a friend that he would not go back. Something changed on the second night of the investigators' visit. Until then, the voice had replied only to those who lived in the house. That detail had made some of the visitors dismissive. They assumed the phenomenon depended on suggestion. The researchers set up their machines in the kitchen, checked battery levels, mapped cold spots, and spoke softly about signal interference and shared delusion. Near midnight, one of them sat alone at the table, writing notes by lamplight while the others smoked outside. He later claimed he had been thinking, with some irritation, that the case had been exaggerated by frightened people who needed the company of strangers. He did not speak, he did not sigh, he merely wrote the thought in his head as one writes a sentence on an unseen wall. From the hallway behind him came a quiet response. Then go home. He turned so suddenly the chair legs snapped against the tile. The others heard that sound and came inside. On the tape, there was no question, no lead-in, no human voice from the table. Only the scratch of the investigator's pencil, then the answer from the hall, clear enough that even skeptics later admitted it was difficult to dismiss. The phrasing was flat, not angry, not threatening. It sounded almost weary, as though whatever spoke had already endured too much of the living and wished to be left in peace. That recording was the one most often discussed, but it was not the one that ended the visits. The most disturbing account came from the woman who lived in the house and from the investigator who had thought privately at the kitchen table. According to both of them, the activity deepened after people began expecting it. The voice no longer answered practical thoughts. It began replying to memories. A man would think of his dead brother while standing alone in the bathroom mirror, and from the bedroom behind him, the voice would say the brother's childhood nickname. A woman folding blankets would recall, against her will, the face of her mother in a hospital bed, and from the dark hall, a voice would say, "She knew you lied." The words were not shouted. They arrived in the same mild tone, close to the ground, with a kind of domestic familiarity that made them unbearable. Whatever spoke seemed less interested in frightening the house than in entering the private space people usually keep even from those they love. After that, sleep in the house changed. No one wanted to drift off fully. No one wanted to dream too deeply. The family began leaving lamps on in 2 rooms and a radio murmuring in the kitchen through the night, as if a little human noise could keep something older from settling in. Still, the worst incidents came after midnight, when conversation thinned, when thoughts loosened and grew vivid in the dark. One son, not yet grown, started covering his ears before bed, though that did nothing. Another refused to think in complete sentences once night fell. He would distract himself with songs, arithmetic, baseball rosters, anything broken and harmless, because he had become convinced that the voice could only answer a whole thought. For a short time, that seemed to help. Then, one night, sometime after 1 a.m., his recorder picked up a whisper close to the mattress, so close it seemed to rise from under the bed frame itself. "You do not need words." The family considered leaving. Whether they truly tried is less certain. Some later versions of the story say they packed twice and unpacked both times before dawn. Others say the oldest woman in the household refused to go because the land had belonged to the family in one form or another for years beyond easy counting, and she would not be turned out by wind, rumor, or devil's play. There was also a local belief, mentioned quietly by one of the visitors, that certain places in the high desert do not improve when abandoned. A trouble in an empty house does not fade, according to that belief. It grows simpler, freer. It waits for whatever comes next. More tapes were made, several were lost, some were said to have been copied and passed around privately in the region. A few descriptions remain. In one, there is the sound of a pot falling in the kitchen, though nobody enters the room. In another, a dog begins growling toward a closed bedroom closet and then abruptly whines as if recognizing something. On one of the last known recordings, two people sit together in silence for almost a full minute. Wind rubs against the outside of the house, boards shift, one person is breathing too fast, the other seems to be trying not to. Then a man's voice from the ceiling or the hallway or the next room, impossible to place, says, in a tone almost conversational, "You should not think of the well." No one on the tape had mentioned a well. There was one, though, old, dry, capped with timber, some distance behind the house where the ground dipped away into brush and stone. It had not been used in years. The children had been warned away from it so often that it had faded into the scenery, just another hazard in a place full of thorns, nails, rusted wire, and sudden holes in the earth. After the recording, the family went out there in daylight with two of the investigators and the retired sheriff, though he had said he was done with the matter. The cover looked undisturbed. The boards were gray and warped, with iron fittings stained dark by weather. When they pried the top loose, a smell rose from below, so old and damp it seemed unrelated to the desert itself. Not rot exactly, not earth, just stillness, held too long underground. The well was not deep enough to hide a body, some said. Others disagreed. Nothing publicly confirmed was ever recovered from it, and later retellings drift apart wildly at this point, as such stories do. One version claims they found only water-blackened debris and the bones of small animals. Another says there were signs the shaft had once been extended and filled in. A third insists that when one of the men leaned over with a lantern, the tape recorder clipped with a sound like someone speaking directly into the microphone from beneath the earth, though no words could be separated. There is no firm record to settle the question. What survived was the effect. After the well was opened, the voice inside the house grew more frequent. It also grew more personal. The woman in the kitchen, the one from the first tape, later told a friend that the voice began using endearments no stranger should have known. Names from childhood, phrases spoken years earlier in grief and never repeated. Once, while washing dishes after midnight, she remembered a morning when she had stood by a hospital bed and silently wished for an ending before the suffering could continue. She had never confessed that thought to anyone. The guilt of it had traveled with her for years like a stone in the body. As she stood at the sink, the room dim, except for the weak yellow light above the stove, the voice came from the pantry with a soft little chuckle underneath it and answered the memory as though continuing a conversation left unfinished. "You meant it." She dropped a glass, it shattered at her feet, the tape caught the break, the breath, the hurried steps backward, but the voice did not return. That was another pattern people noticed. It said only what was needed. It did not ramble, it did not plead, it did not perform. It left the rest in silence. Toward the end, some neighbors believed the family had changed. Not in some dramatic way, but in the small, exhausted way people change when nights stop being safe. They forgot ordinary things. They stared too long at nothing, their speech thinned. One of the children, when asked at school why he looked so tired, reportedly said that talking was not the hard part anymore, thinking was. Local residents repeated that line for years afterward, often with a small pause before the last word, as though testing how it sounded in open air. What finally happened in the house is uncertain. The family did leave for a time, according to some accounts. According to others, only part of the family left, while an older relative stayed behind and refused help. There are scattered rumors of a fire that never fully took hold, of a priest who would not enter after sunset, of tapes mailed anonymously and never heard from again. Publicly discussed incidents rarely end as neatly as campfire stories want them to. They fray, people die, papers are misplaced, houses pass to distant relatives or stand empty until the roof gives way and weather carries the last shape out of them. The adobe house in northern New Mexico, if it still stands, is not easy to identify from the stories. Details were softened over time, either to protect the family or because no one telling it was ever entirely sure. But the legend remains stubborn in the region because of one final detail, repeated by more than one person who claimed contact with the case. The voice, they said, did not haunt the place in the way people usually mean. It did not seem bound to footsteps, doors, or rooms. It attached itself to inward attention, to the small, silent act of turning a thought over in the mind after midnight and waiting, without meaning to, for an answer. Years later, copies of the surviving recordings were said to circulate in private hands, usually played low, usually after dark, and almost never all the way through. People who heard them disagreed about what the voice said, and some heard nothing unusual at all. Yet, now and then, someone would stop the tape before it ended and ask for the player to be shut off. Not because of the sound itself, they would explain, but because of what arrived in the room afterward. The feeling that a conversation had started somewhere nearby. The strange reluctance to think too clearly. The cold impression that the silence around them was not empty silence, but listening silence. And in some versions of the story, the last tape ends with no voice at all. Only a room after midnight, a faint mechanical hiss, the breathing of someone trying very hard to keep their thoughts shapeless. Then, after a long minute, the recorder is switched off by a hand that never comes into view. And just before the click, so low it could be dust crossing the microphone, there is the suggestion of one final reply, spoken to something no one else can hear yet. The neighbor who never left his house in upstate New York. By the time the porch light came on again, the man who had lived there was supposed to be gone. It happened just after midnight, when the houses on that road had already gone dark and the trees beyond the back fences had become one black wall. A woman across the street woke for no clear reason, crossed her bedroom in bare feet, and looked through the lace curtain toward the old narrow house with the peeling white paint. The front room was lit. Not brightly, just enough to show the long shape of the window and the faint shadow of someone moving past it, slow and deliberate, as if crossing a room he had crossed 1,000 times before. She stood there until the shape disappeared. In the morning, she told herself she had dreamed it. By breakfast, she remembered that the man next door had not been seen for days, and that 2 men from the county had already been there once, pulling shut the front door behind them as they left. He had been the kind of neighbor people described in fragments, quiet, thin, older than he first looked from a distance, younger than he seemed when he stepped into the light. He collected his mail at odd hours. In winter, he shoveled one narrow path from the porch to the sidewalk and nowhere else. In summer, he cut only the strip of grass visible from the road, leaving the backyard to grow wild and silver under the moon. No one on the street could say with confidence where he had come from or whether he had family nearby. There were stories, of course, because there were always stories around a house where the curtains stayed drawn and no visitors ever parked at the curb. Some said he had once worked nights. Some said he had lost someone and never recovered. Some said he simply did not like being seen. What people did know was that he was still there, until suddenly he was not. According to neighbors, the change began with the smell. Not a strong smell at first, just something stale drifting down the sidewalk in the wet cold of early spring, mixing with thawing mud and old leaves. Then came the newspapers left untouched on the porch, then the milk bottles, on the rare weeks he ordered them, standing where the morning frost had clouded the glass. A mail carrier knocked and received no answer. A neighbor mentioned it to another neighbor. By the end of that week, someone made the call to 911, feeling foolish even as she did it, as though bothering the dispatcher over a man who had spent years making it clear he wanted no one's concern. The deputies came in daylight. They went around the side yard first, their shoes disappearing in the high grass, then returned to the front. One knocked. The other looked into the lower corner of a window and stepped back at once. A little later, an ambulance came and then left without haste. No one on the street said much afterward. They only watched. The front door was shut, the curtains remained closed, the county car drove away. By evening, the house looked exactly as it had the day before, except for the fact that people now understood, in that quiet suburban way, that the man who had lived there would not be seen again. No obituary appeared that anyone could find. No relatives came to empty the rooms. No realtor's sign appeared in the yard. The mailbox remained. The porch light stayed off for nearly a week. Then, on the 7th night, it came back on. At first, people reached for sensible explanations because that was easier than letting a small wrong thing become a larger one. A timer, someone said. An electrical fault. A distant cousin with a key. The county had probably not done much beyond securing the door. Houses did strange things when they were left alone. Pipes clicked. Lights flickered. Old floorboards shifted. A curtain with a loose hem could move in a draft and look like a hand. Then, the kitchen light came on too. It happened while rain passed over the neighborhood in fine gray sheets that made the street lamps hum. The house stood dim and square against the weather, the upstairs dark, the front room lit as before. Then, without warning, a yellow light appeared in the rear of the house, the kind of warm, square light that suggested someone rinsing a cup at the sink or standing motionless at a counter. It stayed on for nearly an hour. When it finally went out, the front room remained lit. Just before dawn, both lights died at once. A retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Harrow, who had lived on that street longer than anyone else, claimed she saw more than light. She had been awake in her downstairs chair, knitting with the television muted, when she noticed a shape pass the sheer curtain in the front window. Not quickly, not with the nervous pace of a trespasser. It moved with the private slowness of a resident who knew where every chair and table stood in the dark. She later told one neighbor that what unsettled her was not the figure itself, but the interval between one pass and the next. It crossed once. Then again, several minutes later, in exactly the same direction, at exactly the same speed, as if repeating a habit rather than accomplishing anything. The next afternoon, a younger man from 3 houses down walked over and knocked. He had a delivery package in his hand, though there had been no delivery. He only wanted a reason to stand on the porch and listen. The boards creaked under his weight. The brass knocker was cold. He waited after the sound of his knock had faded and thought, just for a second, that he heard something inside. Not footsteps. Not speech, the small, dry scrape of a chair leg moving over a floor. He left the package there anyway, a blank cardboard box with nothing in it, and glanced back twice before reaching the sidewalk. By evening, the box was gone. That was when the street stopped speaking about the house in open daylight. It became the sort of subject that entered conversation only after dark, in kitchens with one overhead bulb and the low clink of dishes, or on porches where voices carried no farther than the railing. People began comparing details they had kept to themselves. One woman said she heard the back door open and close sometime after 2 a.m., though the yard remained empty when she looked. A boy home from college said he saw a dim shape standing at the second-floor window in a room no one remembered ever seeing lit while the man was alive. Mrs. Harrow insisted there was a rhythm to the house now. Front room first, kitchen later, sometimes the stair landing after midnight. Once, unmistakably, the bathroom light, which glowed weak and green through textured glass before vanishing again. Someone contacted the county office to ask whether the property had been turned over to anyone. The answer, according to the person who made the call, was unsatisfying. Records were pending. There had been difficulty locating next of kin, the property was not yet cleared for sale, no one could say whether anyone had official access in the meantime. It was not the kind of answer that settled a neighborhood. It was the kind that left a thin opening for anything to be imagined. The most disturbing detail surfaced near the midpoint of that strange month, and it came from the least dramatic witness on the street. A postal worker, filling in on the route, mentioned in passing that the mailbox at the old house had been emptied twice that week. Not stuffed, not overflowing, emptied. He remembered because the box was old and stiff and needed to be tugged hard to open, and on both mornings it had swung lightly, recently handled. He did not know the story behind the house. He only remarked on it to another carrier. By the time the comment reached the neighbors, it no longer sounded ordinary. After that, people began looking more carefully. From certain angles, the house could be watched without appearing watched. Between 2 hedges on the opposite side of the road, there was a narrow view of the side entrance. From the second floor of Mrs. Harrow's house there was a direct line to the upstairs landing through a gap where the curtain never fully closed. A man with insomnia started smoking in his garage with the door open 2 inches, using the reflective strip of the window glass to monitor the porch across the street. He later said the waiting became worse than the sightings. Minutes stretched, the road stayed empty, nothing moved. Then some small change would happen inside the house, and all the silence around it seemed to retreat by an inch. One night, during a windstorm that bent the maple branches almost to the gutters, the front door opened. It did not swing wide, it eased inward and stopped, revealing only darkness beyond the storm screen. The porch light burned over the chipped steps. Leaves skittered along the pavement. No one stepped out. The door remained open through the worst of the wind, gently shifting on its hinges, until a gust struck the screen hard enough to rattle it. Then, with no visible hand, it closed again. The next morning, there were no footprints in the damp soil of the flower bed, no marks in the wet grit on the porch, no sign that anyone had crossed the threshold. But the doormat had been turned sideways. Local gossip began attaching itself to older stories, the way damp fabric collects burrs. Someone remembered hearing that the man had once cared for an invalid relative inside that house and had continued speaking to empty rooms long after the relative died. Someone else claimed the house had belonged to his mother before him and that she too had been seen at windows after her funeral, though no one could say who first told that story. Another neighbor, trying to sound rational, suggested there might be a squatter entering from the cellar, but even he spoke softly when he said it, because the image of a hidden living intruder was somehow worse than the alternatives. At last, 2 men from the town returned with a locksmith and a patrol car. It was afternoon again, cloudy and cold. Curtains shifted all along the street as people watched from indoors. The men knocked first. Then they unlocked the front door and disappeared inside. They remained there long enough for the onlookers to grow restless. When they emerged, one of them carried a paper bag. The other stood on the porch, speaking into a phone, his face unreadable from that distance. Before leaving, they nailed a notice to the door and stretched tape across the frame. It looked final, official, almost comforting. That night, the front room light came on behind the taped door. No one on the street admitted sleeping well after that. The tape remained unbroken for 3 days. Through the front window, when the light was on, it could be seen plainly across the glass panel of the door, pale and taut. This detail lodged itself in people's minds because it ruined every easy explanation. If someone had gone in through the front, the tape would have torn. If someone had left by that route, the notice would have shifted. Yet the lights still moved from room to room in a patient sequence, and once, close to dawn, Mrs. Harrow said she saw a shadow pause just inside the doorway where the notice faced inward, as though reading it. The heavy reveal came later, when curiosity overcame caution in the only person on the street foolish enough to act alone. His name has been lost in the retelling, or perhaps people no longer say it out of fairness. He was younger than most of the residents, rented rather than owned, and worked odd hours that made him too familiar with the long, empty stretch between midnight and sunrise. On a night when the house was lit downstairs and the road was empty, he crossed over with a flashlight and went around the back. He would later describe the yard as unnaturally still, no crickets. No distant traffic, even the loose branch over the shed seemed to hold itself in place. At the rear door, he found no tape, only a rusted knob and a small window dark with grime. He pressed his ear to it and heard what he first took for water running somewhere far inside. When he looked through the glass, the beam of his flashlight caught the edge of a kitchen table, a sink full of dull reflections, and beyond that, a hallway opening into deeper darkness. On the table sat the cardboard package he himself had left on the front porch days earlier. It had been opened with care. The top flaps were folded back neatly. Inside the empty box lay a stack of mail bound with twine. He backed away at once, circled toward the side yard, and nearly ran into the thing that frightened him enough to leave town before summer. There was someone at the upstairs window. Not a face pressed against the pane, not a theatrical apparition, just the unmistakable outline of a person standing in profile where the curtain failed to meet the frame. Shoulders slightly bowed, one hand lifted near the chin, still as furniture. He said later that he would have convinced himself it was a coat on a hanger if not for one detail. The outline shifted its weight. Only a little, but enough to be human, enough that he stumbled backward in the wet grass and dropped the flashlight. By the time he found it and aimed it up again, the window was empty. The police came because he called them breathing hard and ashamed. They searched again. According to later talk, they found the rear door locked from within and had to force it. They went through the rooms one by one. Nothing. No intruder, no bedding, no food opened recently beyond what had spoiled weeks before. The cardboard box was indeed on the kitchen table, along with the old mail, though no one could explain how it had entered the house. What they did find in the back parlor beneath a layer of dust was an armchair positioned toward the front window. The carpet before it was worn in an oval. Beside the chair stood a lamp plugged into a timer. On the mantel was a second timer attached to nothing. Upstairs, on the landing, another lamp had been set facing the hall. In the bathroom, the weak green bulb had burned almost to black. This should have settled everything. Timers could explain the lights, the worn carpet could explain the passing shadow, the rest could be fear and gossip arranging scraps into a pattern. But the chair in the back parlor was warm. One officer reportedly touched the armrest while checking the room and drew his hand back in surprise. Not hot, not heated by a vent, simply warm, as if someone had risen from it only moments before. That detail was never put into any public record anyone saw, and perhaps it never happened at all. Yet it persisted, carried from one kitchen to another, from one porch to the next, because it fit too neatly with everything people had half believed already. In neighborhoods like that, what is missing from the record often survives longer than what is written down. After the second search, the house was finally cleared out. Months later, workers came, the curtains were taken down, the old furniture was removed. Windows were opened for the first time in years, and stale air poured into the street with the smell of dust, wet plaster, and something older underneath. By autumn, the place had been sold to a couple from farther south. They painted the siding, cut back the yard, replaced the porch light, and told anyone who asked that the house felt smaller inside than they expected. They stayed until the first snow. No one ever got a full explanation for why they left so quickly. The official reason, according to a neighbor who spoke with them once while they loaded a truck, was that the commute was wrong and the repairs were more expensive than planned. Yet after they were gone, Mrs. Harrow mentioned that on several cold evenings, she had seen the husband standing in the yard, not looking at the road or the roofline, but at the upstairs landing window with the expression of a man listening for a sound that had not yet started. The house passed through other hands after that. Time softened the story. Children who grew up nearby remembered only that there had been a place adults disliked discussing. The original resident became less a person than a shape inside a rumor. A solitary man in a narrow house whose departure had not ended his routine. Records thinned, witnesses died or moved away. The county notice vanished. Trees grew taller. New owners came and went. Even now, according to people who still live on roads like that in upstate New York, there are winter nights when a certain kind of silence settles over a block and one house appears brighter than it should be, though no car sits in the drive and no footsteps mark the snow. A lamp glows in the front room, a shadow passes once behind the curtain. Then, minutes later, it passes again at the same slow pace, repeating a path known too well to be broken by death. And the most unsettling part of the old story is not the thought that someone remained in that house after he was believed gone. It is the smaller, colder possibility that he never understood he had left at all and simply continued with the only life he had, moving from room to room, collecting the mail, turning on the lights, and pausing sometimes at the window to look out at the neighbors who had finally begun to look back. The Unlocked Door, the Sacramento Vampire. There is a profound fragility to the concept of home. We surround ourselves with walls of plaster and wood, arrange our furniture, and fill the space with the soft light of television screens and the quiet hum of refrigerators. We convince ourselves that the perimeter is secure, but the boundary between the absolute safety of a living room and the vast, unpredictable darkness of the outside world relies almost entirely on a single piece of metal. A deadbolt, a latch, a simple twist of the wrist before bed. In the sleepy, sun-baked suburbs of Sacramento, California, in the winter of 1977, that illusion of safety was shattered forever. The residents of those quiet neighborhoods would soon learn that a door is only a barrier if you remember to lock it. If you forget, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes an invitation. To understand the creeping dread that paralyzed the city during the early weeks of 1978, one must understand the twisted logic of the man walking its streets. Richard Trenton Chase was fundamentally broken, his mind consumed by severe paranoid schizophrenia. He did not live in the same reality as the families settling down for dinner behind their suburban windows. Chase was haunted by somatic delusions of the most horrifying nature. He believed with absolute and terrifying certainty that his heart was shrinking. He believed his own blood was turning into a dry, useless powder. In his decaying mind, the only cure, the only way to keep his own heart beating, was to consume the fresh blood and organs of others. He began with the neighborhood animals, leaving a trail of mutilated pets and gruesome remains in the quiet canyons and empty lots. But as his illness deepened, the animals were no longer enough to satisfy the frantic, paranoid demands of his failing body. The shadow that was Richard Chase began to turn his hollow eyes toward the houses, towards the people living inside them. And as he walked the sidewalks in a filthy, oversized orange ski parka, his pockets heavy with a .22 caliber pistol and a butcher knife, he operated under a very specific, deeply ingrained delusion regarding the rules of entry. To Chase, a locked door was an insurmountable barrier. It was a clear, undeniable statement of rejection. If he walked up to a porch, gripped the brass handle, and found it held fast by a lock, he would simply let go and walk away. He believed that the locked door meant he was not welcome there. But an unlocked door held a completely different meaning. In the fractured, magical thinking of his mind, an unlocked door was not an oversight. It was not a neighbor taking out the trash, or a teenager running to the car, or a tired mother simply forgetting to turn the deadbolt after carrying groceries inside. To Richard Chase, an unlocked door was an open, willful invitation to enter. Imagine the sheer horror of this delusion applied to the mundane reality of everyday life. You are sitting in your favorite chair. The evening news is murmuring on the television. The hallway is bathed in the warm, yellow glow of a reading lamp. You are relaxed, defenseless, wearing your comfortable clothes, entirely enveloped in the sanctuary of your own home. You hear the faint, metallic click of the front doorknob turning. You do not panic. Your mind rationalizes the sound instantly. It must be your husband returning from his shift or your roommate coming back from the store. You do not even turn your head as the heavy wooden door swings open on its hinges. But the footsteps that cross the threshold are too heavy. The breathing is ragged, wet, and frantic. And when you finally look up, it is not a loved one standing in your foyer. It is a hollow-eyed stranger, his clothes stiff with dried, dark stains, casually stepping into your sanctuary with a butcher knife in his hand, looking at you not with malice, but with the cold, calculated entitlement of an invited guest. This nightmare became reality on the 23rd of January, 1978. Teresa Wallen, a 22-year-old woman who was 3 months pregnant, was enjoying a quiet morning in her home. The sun was up, the neighborhood was awake. It was the kind of ordinary morning that promises nothing but routine. Teresa had briefly stepped out to empty the garbage, a chore so mundane it barely registers in the memory. When she stepped back inside, she closed the front door behind her. But she did not lock it. Why would she? It was broad daylight. She was safe in her own home. Moments later, Richard Chase walked up her driveway. He approached the front door. He reached out with pale, trembling fingers and tested the handle. The latch clicked. The door gave way. The invitation was accepted. The details of what occurred inside the Wallen home over the next hour are a descent into profound, unspeakable darkness. Chase did not sneak in. He simply entered. When he encountered Teresa, there was no hesitation. He shot her fatally, and then the true horror of his pathology was unleashed. He utilized the butcher knife he brought with him, acting with the frantic, messy desperation of a starving man at a banquet. He harvested what he believed he needed to survive. He bathed in her blood. He drank from her, using a yogurt cup he found in her own kitchen, turning the mundane objects of her domestic life into tools of his gruesome ritual. When her husband returned home later that afternoon, he did not just find his wife dead, he found his sanctuary violated, transformed into an abattoir, all because the front door had been left unlatched. The terror in Sacramento escalated with blinding speed. Just 4 days later, on the 27th of January, the invitation was extended again. Less than a mile away, another door was left unlocked. This time, it was the home of 38-year-old Evelyn Myroth. Inside the house with her were her friend Dan Meredith, her 6-year-old nephew Jason Sorois, and her 22-month-old nephew Baby David. 4 people going about their day behind a door that someone had forgotten to secure. Chase tested the knob. It turned. The nightmare walked in from the daylight. Dan Meredith was in the hallway when the front door opened. Chase shot him in the head at close range, stepping over his body to move deeper into the house. The violence that followed was methodical and devastating. He found Evelyn and young Jason in the bedroom. The walls of the suburban home echoed with the sharp cracks of the .22 caliber pistol, quickly muffled by the heavy silence that followed. Once again, Chase engaged in his horrific post-mortem rituals upon Evelyn, his mind driving him to consume, to take, to sustain his own fading existence with their vital fluids. The quiet of the neighborhood outside remained entirely undisturbed. The mail was delivered, cars drove past. No one knew that behind the unlocked door, a monster was tearing a family apart. When Chase finally left the Myroth house, he did not leave empty-handed. He carried the lifeless body of baby David with him, slipping back out into the mundane world as easily as he had entered it. The baby's remains would not be found for months, discarded in a vacant lot, another casualty of the open door. The aftermath of the discoveries paralyzed the region. The Sacramento Police Department, seasoned detectives who had seen the worst of human nature, were physically ill at the crime scenes. The sheer brutality, the senselessness of it, defied all conventional investigative logic. There was no forced entry, no shattered glass, no splintered door frames. The killer was walking through the front door like a ghost. When the media released the details that the killer was entering unlocked homes, a wave of visceral panic washed over the city. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts, chain locks, and window latches in a matter of hours. Gun sales skyrocketed. People adopted large, aggressive dogs. The warm, trusting culture of the California suburbs evaporated overnight. Neighbors looked at neighbors with suspicion, but mostly people looked at their own doors. The nightly routine of checking the locks became an obsessive, terrified ritual. Husbands and wives would check the deadbolt twice, 3 times, unable to shake the image of the hollow-eyed man walking into their hallway. The fear was no longer about the dark alleys or the bad parts of town. The fear was sitting in the living room, staring at the brass handle, wondering if it was turned all the way. Law enforcement eventually caught Richard Chase. Through a combination of eyewitness accounts of the man in the orange parka, footprint analysis, and sheer investigative legwork, they traced the horror back to his apartment. When detectives breached his door, a door he ironically kept locked, they found a space that mirrored the absolute decay of his mind. The apartment was a slaughterhouse. Blood stained the walls, the floors, the kitchen utensils. They found blenders slick with human remains. They found a calendar where he had marked the dates of his hunt. The evidence of his madness was absolute and undeniable. Chase was institutionalized, tried, and eventually died in his cell from an overdose of hoarded medication, a pathetic end to a terrifying existence. But the death of the Sacramento vampire did not erase the psychological scar he left behind. The true horror of Richard Chase is not just the gruesome nature of his crimes, nor the tragic loss of 6 innocent lives. The true horror lies in the terrible, fragile line between safety and slaughter. He proved that the monsters do not always have to break the glass or bash down the wood to get to you. Sometimes they just walk down your quiet street, walk up your concrete steps, and place their hand on your doorknob. They wait for that one momentary lapse in judgment. That one night you are too tired to get off the couch. That one afternoon you are just running out to the garbage can for 5 seconds. They wait for the soft metallic click that tells them the barrier is gone. They wait for the invitation. A Banff trail case where time did not match the distance. When search and rescue volunteers finally located David near the lower bend of the Banff Ridge Trail, the immediate confusion was not that he was injured, but that he was entirely unrecognizable. He had been missing for exactly 48 hours. Yet, as the lead tracker approached the slumped figure resting against a decaying cedar tree, he noted that the man possessed a thick, untrimmed beard and fingernails that had grown long, yellowed, and brittle. His hiking boots, purchased brand new just 3 days prior, according to his wife, were worn down to the smooth, treadless rubber. The leather of the boots was cracked and bleached by an impossible amount of sun. He sat only 2 miles from the main parking lot, staring vacantly into the dense, damp ferns. The incident occurred in October of 1998 in a remote, fog-heavy stretch of the Cascade Mountains. David was 34 years old, an experienced outdoorsman who closely followed local elevation shifts and weather patterns. He had planned a simple 6-mile loop up the ridge and back down through the valley. It was a Saturday. He left a detailed itinerary on his kitchen counter, stating he would be home by 6 o'clock in the evening. When darkness fell and his vehicle remained the only one left in the gravel lot at the trailhead, the local Forest Service was notified. By Sunday morning, a standard grid search had commenced. The weather was unusually mild for late autumn. There was no rain, no sudden drop in temperature, and no wind to disturb the forest floor. Search dogs were brought in to trace his scent from the driver's side door of his car to the wooden trailhead marker. They followed the invisible path easily for the first mile, their noses pressed to the damp earth. But near an area locals called the Silent Basin, a natural depression surrounded by towering, moss-draped Douglas firs, the dogs stopped. They did not bark, and they did not whine. They simply sat down on the trail, refusing to cross an invisible threshold, their focus locked on the empty woods ahead. The human searchers pressed on, leaving the animals behind and moving through the basin in a sweeping line. The silence in that specific section of the forest was profound. Several volunteers later reported a strange heavy pressure in their ears, similar to the sensation of descending rapidly in an airplane. The natural sounds of the woods, the rustling of leaves, the calls of distant birds, and the rushing of nearby creeks simply ceased to exist. It was in this pocket of dead air that they found the first strange piece of evidence. It was a single boot print pressed deep into a patch of soft mud. The tread pattern matched the new boots David had been wearing. However, the stride length was entirely wrong. The distance between the right footprint and the next left footprint was nearly 9 feet. It was a distance impossible for a man to cover in a single walking step, suggesting he had been running at a dead sprint or perhaps leaping in blind terror. More disturbing to the trackers was the direction. The footprints did not lead deeper into the woods, nor did they lead back toward the trail. They turned abruptly and led straight into a dense wall of thorny underbrush where no path existed. Following the projected path of those leaping strides, a volunteer found a discarded plastic water bottle resting upright on a flat stone. It belonged to David. It was completely empty, bone dry on the inside, without a single drop of condensation. The clear plastic had yellowed significantly and turned brittle to the touch, exactly as if it had been sitting in the relentless heat of a desert sun for several years. When the volunteer picked it up, the plastic cracked audibly beneath the light pressure of his fingers. The search was suspended at nightfall and resumed early Monday morning. The atmosphere on the mountain had shifted overnight. A thick, clinging mist rolled through the pine trees, limiting visibility to less than 50 feet. At approximately 9:15 a.m., a Forest Service dispatcher monitoring the emergency radio channels caught a brief, heavily distorted transmission. It was not broadcast on the standard civilian band, nor was it intercepted on a ham radio frequency. It came through on a secured tactical channel used exclusively by park rangers and emergency personnel. The voice breaking through the heavy static was weak, parched, and trembling. It was later positively identified as David by his wife, though the tone was undeniably altered. He did not ask for help. He did not provide his coordinates or describe his injuries. Instead, the dispatcher listened as the man muttered in a low, exhausted, almost hypnotic monotone. He stated clearly that the sun had not come up. He repeated this exact phrase 3 times. He then whispered that he had been walking down the same slope for weeks, but the trees were only getting taller and the path beneath his feet was turning to gray ash. The transmission ended abruptly with a sharp, mechanical click. Tracking the signal proved impossible. The radio tower logs showed no origin point for the broadcast, no triangulation data, and no registered radio ID. It was as if the audio had simply manifested directly out of the speakers in the dispatch room. Meanwhile, the ground teams were circling back toward the lower bend of the trail, sweeping an area they had already thoroughly checked the day before. The mist was particularly thick near the base of the ridge. It was here, just 20 yards off the marked path, that a volunteer noticed a dark shape huddled against the massive roots of a dead tree. David did not react when his name was called. His eyes were open, but he did not blink. The pupils were dilated to the very edge of his irises, rendering his eyes completely black against the pale whites. The paramedics who arrived on the scene documented an array of physical impossibilities. He was severely malnourished, his collarbones and ribcage visible beneath the torn remnants of his wool sweater. His skin was leathered, deeply tanned, and heavily weathered. The internal zipper of his jacket, made of stainless steel, had rusted completely shut. But the most disturbing detail was the digital watch strapped securely to his left wrist. The glass face of the watch was scratched and clouded with thick condensation. The digital readout was still functioning, powered by a specialized, long-lasting battery. When the lead medic checked the screen to log the official time of recovery, he found that the watch displayed a date in the middle of October in the year 2005. The internal calendar of the device had advanced exactly 7 years over the course of 48 hours. The stopwatch function, which David frequently used to time his hikes, was still running. It showed over 61,000 hours logged. They carried him out of the woods on a rigid backboard. He offered no resistance, his limbs limp and unresponsive. The medics estimated he weighed no more than 110 pounds, a staggering loss from his documented weight of 180. At the local hospital, the attending physicians were baffled by his preliminary blood work. His body showed the advanced stages of prolonged starvation and severe vitamin deficiencies, conditions that typically take many months, if not years, to develop. The soles of his feet provided further grim evidence. When the nurses removed the remnants of his wool socks, they found the skin covered in thick, hardened calluses. The heels were split and bleeding, with layers of dead tissue built up in a manner consistent with someone who had walked barefoot across rough terrain for thousands of miles. Yet, despite these signs of immense physical decay over an agonizingly long period, an examination of his digestive tract revealed the partially digested remains of the oat granola bar he had been seen eating in his car on Saturday morning. Biological time and chronological time had violently separated within his own body. Investigators attempted to piece together the missing 2 days by examining his personal belongings. His day pack, constructed of heavy-duty, weather-resistant nylon, was frayed at every seam. The bright red fabric was bleached almost white, heavily stained with a pale gray dust that did not match the soil composition of the Cascade Mountains. Deep inside the main compartment, wrapped inside a brittle plastic bag, they found his 35mm camera. The film roll was carefully extracted in a darkroom and sent to a specialized laboratory for development. There were 24 exposures on the roll. The first 3 photographs were perfectly normal. They depicted the gravel parking lot, the wooden trailhead marker, and a shot of the morning mist rolling through the lower valley. The lighting was consistent with an overcast Saturday morning. The 4th photograph, however, showed the edge of the silent basin, and the lighting was deeply unnatural. The shadows cast by the dense fir trees fell in conflicting directions, crisscrossing over the trail, suggesting multiple dim light sources in the sky, none of them directly overhead. From the 5th frame onward, the images documented a landscape that no park ranger, surveyor, or local historian could identify. The trees in the photographs were dead and entirely stripped of bark. Their trunks were smooth, twisting upward like blackened, broken fingers against a pale, featureless sky. The ground was covered in a thick layer of the same gray ash found on his backpack. There was no underbrush, no rocks, and no trail markers. Just an endless, repeating expanse of dead timber and gray dust. The photographs grew increasingly erratic as the roll progressed. Frames 15 through 20 were heavily blurred, taken in motion. The camera was pointed downward or angled wildly at the sky, suggesting the photographer was running in absolute panic. The lighting in these middle frames grew progressively darker, the featureless sky fading into a deep, impenetrable black. The final photograph on the roll, the 24th frame, remains the most debated and heavily classified piece of evidence in the entire case file. It was severely underexposed, dominated by absolute darkness. But near the center of the frame, caught in a grainy, out-of-focus blur, was a towering structure. It appeared to be a massive stone staircase carved directly into the side of an impossibly sheer cliff face. Standing on the lower steps of the staircase were tall, vaguely human silhouettes. They were elongated and impossibly thin, their limbs disproportionate to their bodies. Their featureless heads were turned entirely toward the camera lens. The only illumination in the photograph was a dim, sickly red glow radiating from the top of the stairs, casting long, unnatural shadows down the steps. David never regained the ability to speak. He spent his remaining weeks in a secure, private room in a state medical ward. He spent his days sitting rigidly in a chair, staring blankly out the window at the distant tree line of the surrounding hills. He refused to sleep in the dark. He became violently agitated, screaming soundlessly if the nurses attempted to turn off the overhead fluorescent lights. Whenever the room darkened, even momentarily from a passing cloud, he would scramble backward, press his spine against the farthest wall, and cover his eyes with his bruised, trembling hands. His physical deterioration accelerated at a terrifying, unnatural rate. Within a single month, his untrimmed hair and beard turned entirely stark white. His teeth loosened and fell out. His bone density collapsed, leaving him fragile and bedridden. Medical specialists were flown in from out of state, but they could only diagnose his condition as an incredibly aggressive, entirely unprecedented form of rapid cellular aging. He was aging years in a matter of days. He passed away quietly in his sleep on a Tuesday evening in late November, exactly 6 weeks after he was found near the trail. The official death certificate filed by the county coroner listed the primary cause of death as complete heart failure brought on by severe environmental exposure and clinical dehydration. No mention of the advanced cellular decay, the mismatched timeline, or the impossible state of his equipment was included in the public medical record. The investigative case file was quietly closed. The anomalies were officially written off in internal memos as severe delirium combined with manufacturing defects in his gear. His digital watch was placed in a sealed evidence locker in the basement of the regional precinct, its scratched screen still glowing, silently counting the thousands of impossible hours. The camera, the brittle water bottle, and the envelope of developed photographs were archived deep within the state's missing persons database, filed under an obscure case number, rarely requested and never published for the public to see. But among the tight-knit community of search and rescue teams who still work the Banff Ridge Trail, the story of David remains a quiet, persistent warning. The veteran trackers of the unit will never hike through the Silent Basin alone, regardless of the weather. They advise newcomers to always keep a close eye on their own shadows, ensuring they only ever point in one single direction. And if the surrounding forest ever grows completely, entirely silent, if the birds stop calling and the wind dies down to nothing, they are told to turn around immediately and walk back to the parking lot. They are warned to leave before the path beneath their feet begins to stretch, before the trees start to grow unnaturally tall, and before the time required to walk home becomes longer than the years they have left to live.